This hearing will come to order. So this hearing is on U.S. policy after Russia's escalation in Syria. Nearly 5 years into the Syrian conflict, that conflict has claimed more than 250,000 lives. There are 14 million people right now that have been driven from their homes in Syria. Now, through it all, the administration's response has been tepid. It has been ineffectual. And when I say ineffectual, we had a situation here where we had hearings during the time, a 1-year period, in which, as ISIS began to move out of Raqqa, Syria, during that period of time, as we were calling for airstrikes, as our ambassador in Baghdad was calling for airstrikes, there were 14 major cities that fell to ISIS. Fell at a time when in pickup trucks on an open desert road, these were cleared targets that could have been taken out. But a choice was made. Sometimes indecision, the decision not to make a decision is itself a choice. The choice was made in the United States not to stop ISIS then when it could have been stopped. And the choice was also made not to arm the Kurds. 3 trips out here by the foreign minister of Kurdistan asking for the anti-tank weapons, the artillery, the long-range mortars that they needed. 30% of their troops, 30% of their brigades are women, females, fighting on the front lines against ISIS on a 600-mile front. And the decision was made not to arm them. So ISIS now stands where it stands, gaining ground as a result of our failure to act. Today, the President still hasn't put forward the broad, overarching strategy needed to defeat this brutal movement, this movement of terrorists, and frankly, to secure vital U.S. national security interests here. But instead, it is now Russia that is taking the decisive role in shaping Syria's future, and not in a helpful way. Putin saw Assad losing ground, so Russian jets have teamed up with Iranian ground forces to solidify the Syrian dictator. And the focus of the Russians and Iranians' joint offensive is not ISIS. It is not their strongholds, but it is the opposition forces backed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. Russian bombs, according to the NGO groups that report on this, and they say over half of the Russian attacks have now been on civilian targets. Russian bombs have flattened markets, schools, villages. And the Russians, at one point, were bombing more targets in one solitary day than we hit in a month. And our air campaign there is even more anemic, for those of you that have followed what has happened as a consequence of Russia moving in to these operations. The administration claims that it lacks targets, yet the special forces it is sending to Syria won't even be spotting targets. Russian attacks on the opposition and the slowdown in coalition airstrikes has actually allowed ISIS now to gain territory. ISIS is expanding. Let no one be under the delusion that Russia is focused on ISIS. While the President characterizes Russia's moves as a sign of weakness, it is Assad who is growing stronger. Moscow's efforts show no sign of slowing. Russian cargo aircraft have been seen running Iranian weapons into Syria, a violation of the UN arms embargo, a violation that I assume is not going to be called to attention or challenged. But it is a clear violation of that agreement at the United Nations. And this is especially troubling as we begin another attempt to restart talks between the regime and the opposition on a new constitution and elections. And here's why. Russia claims its goal is a united, secular, and democratic Syria, but its efforts to prop up the Assad regime prove otherwise. How do we expect the opposition to sign on to any sort of ceasefire as long as Russia and Iran are demanding that Assad, who has murdered over 200,000 civilians? For those of us in this hearing room, we have heard in the past Caesar come forward with his photographs that he took, 50,000 photographs of people tortured by the regime. That kind of conduct by this regime means it's lost all legitimacy with the Syrian people. So the Russian plan is to have him stay in power and to ask at the outset that he stays in power. The statement from Vienna didn't even demand that the Assad regime stop using crude barrel bombs, some filled with chlorine gas, against civilians. That would have been a minimum step that the Russians could have supported. But their planes, they provided the Air Force originally to Assad. So a diplomatic solution is only possible with a strong, coherent, moderate opposition that can serve as a bridge from Assad to a new post-conflict government. Yet the administration has done little to help the opposition. Its feeble train and equip program is now defunct. Washington bureaucracy and over-deference to the Shia-led Iraqi government has held up desperately needed weapons shipments to the Kurds. And no one believes Friday's announcement of 50 special forces will be decisive. Ultimately, it is President Obama's responsibility to step up and outline a plan to engage our partners and allies and bring stability to the Middle East. He is the commander-in-chief, but here is where I'd start. As I've already said, we've urged for the longest time decisive airstrikes against ISIS. We've urged for the longest time the arming of the Kurdish and Yazidi men and women out there on the front lines with the weapons they need to turn back ISIS. If we want an opposition to negotiate from a position of strength, why not help create sanctuary areas in Syria? This would help the Syrian people escape both the Assad regime and the Islamic State. This would also allow for more effective humanitarian relief and even slow the exodus of refugees. We must also push back on Russia and Iran's destabilizing intervention in this conflict. And that means passing tough new sanctions on Iran's terrorist proxy, Hezbollah, because it's Hezbollah that is taking over homes in this region that used to be inhabited by Sunnis as the ethnic cleansing continues. So we need to pass that legislation, as the House has done, and take action to uphold the UN arms embargo on Iran in the face of Russian violations. Everyone but the White House seems to know the status quo cannot stand. General David Petraeus recently testified to Congress that Syria is a geopolitical Chernobyl. And like a nuclear disaster, the fallout from the meltdown of Syria threatens to be with us for decades, he said. And the longer it is permitted to continue, the more severe the damage will be. Those were his words. I will now turn to the Democratic side for any opening statement. Yes, let us, Lois.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Royce. So, and I thank you, the witnesses, for being here today. And I know you're going to be able to well handle the questions that are going to be asked to you. Mr. Chair, I wanted just to express a little different point of view. First of all, I want to say this, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this hearing. I think you've raised some very good questions, and you've expressed the great frustration that a lot of us feel about Syria. I mean, it's horrific what's going on. But here's, I mean, some people would say that ISIS or Daesh, whatever we call them today, came about not because of something President Obama did, but I mean, some would argue that it was a previous administration decision to go into Iraq erroneously, that started this mess that we see there today with a failed occupation of Iraq, a new government that was not inclusive. You have a void, and then you see ISIS come from that void. But I do want to say this. I don't want to play the blame game. That's what some people say. But I think what's important now is just to focus on the here and now and what we need to do. I don't believe this mess in Syria and the Middle East is not the fault of our president. There's a lot of blame to go around, but I'm going to put it on terrorists more than the President of the United States. And I'll be very interested in hearing what our two witnesses have to say. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Thank you. We have time left on the opening statement time, and I just want to set a framework here as we have this discussion. I'll say this with the administration and, frankly, with the critics of the administration. I, for one, did not see the value of pursuing with a vetting of the Syrian rebel army. I can say that myself, looking at what happened. But the one thing I want to have emphasized in this hearing is that you can't have things both ways. You can't say we should be putting in U.S. troops on the ground there, and you can't do that and do even a modicum of security for those troops unless you're willing to hold that troop and have a huge investments of our troops. So the people who say the president didn't come in and he should have come in with troops, you just can't come in, drop them in, pull them out. We didn't have intelligence on the ground in Syria to make that safe for those troops at the time. Number two, we have to be prepared for those people that say that those troops have to have the support of tens of thousands of other troops. So let's not have it in this hearing both ways. If you're going to take that tack with the president, you have to be able to say, well, I support ground troops for the long term, tens of thousands on the ground, because you can't put them in there without supporting them safely. So I hope when we have this discussion today, we bear that in mind, and if people have that opinion, then I respect their opinion, but I don't think that that's the best thing for our country at this time. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I would like to make it clear that that's not the opinion of the members of this committee. What the members of this committee called for a full year of indecisive action was a use of our air power, was a memory that we had had 116,000 airstrikes during the first Gulf War against 42 divisions of Saddam Hussein. These were armored divisions, many of them, and that it was very successful during the invasion of Kuwait. What we called for here was not the introduction of U.S. brigades. What we called here was for the President of the United States to use the authority he had in order to take out the beginning of an insurrection that started in pickup trucks. And if you can take out armored divisions, you could certainly from the air take out pickup trucks from the open desert. And the frustration that I'm expressing is over the fact that for 1 year, nothing was done as city after city fell to this marauding terrorist organization. But I should transition to the witnesses today. But it's partly that frustration, and it's partly with meeting time after time on a bipartisan basis with the Kurdish and Yazidi opposition asking for arms and being denied the arms to defend themselves. Those are the issues I'm speaking to. But I, at this time, would like to go to Ambassador Ann Patterson, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. She's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, and previously Ambassador Patterson served in multiple posts, including Egypt and Pakistan, and as Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. And then to Ambassador Victoria Nuland, before assuming her position as Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the Department of State. Ambassador Nuland served as the Department of State spokesperson. She also served as the United States Permanent Representative to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization from 2005 to 2008, focusing heavily on NATO-Russia issues. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record, and the members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. And Ambassador Patterson, if you could begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to explain our strategy for resolving the devastating conflict in Syria and defeating ISIL there. Coming after the President's decision to intensify the campaign against ISIL and Secretary Kerry's meetings in Vienna to design a path forward for a political transition, this hearing is particularly well-timed. Secretary Kerry said it best in Vienna, "Our task is to chart a course out of hell." Since the start of the Syrian war, as you outlined, Mr. Chairman, over 225,000 Syrians have died, and we face the largest refugee crisis since World War II. The conflict has become a magnet for extremists seeking to change the map of the Middle East, destroy economies and cultures, and terrify entire population. It is threatening Syria's neighbors, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, with major consequences for U.S. national interests and beyond. We are pursuing 4 interlinked goals. 1, to defeat ISIS militarily in both Syria and Iraq. 2, to develop a political transition that gives Syria a future without Bashar al-Assad. 3, to ease the suffering of the Syrian people. And 4, to stabilize our allies as they cope with massive refugee outflows. Our strategy is to leverage military action and intensive diplomacy to achieve a political transition in which Syrians ultimately have a government that respects the rights of its people. This political transition is critical to rooting ISIL out of Syria and ending ISIL's ability to threaten Iraq from Syria. As Secretary Kerry said in Vienna, there is absolutely nothing that could do more to fight Daesh than to achieve a political transition that strengthens the governance capacity of Syria, sideline the person we believe attracts so many foreign fighters and so much terror, and unites the country against terrorism. We cannot defeat ISIL in Iraq without also defeating ISIL in Syria. Moving forward, we first are intensifying the military campaign against ISIL through airstrikes and cooperation with local partners who have already pushed ISIL out of all but 68 miles of the nearly 600-mile border between Syria and Turkey. We and our coalition partners have launched over 2,600 strikes in Syria, and thanks to Turkish support, we are deploying A-10s and F-15s to Incirlik Air Base to expand our strike capacity. The President, as you mentioned, has ordered the deployment of up to 50 U.S. Special Operations Forces in northern Syria to work with our Arab and Kurdish partners, and we will support them with additional air power. Next, the United States is providing $150 million a year to the moderate opposition to meet humanitarian needs and provide governance support in areas liberated from ISIL. As the largest single donor since 2011, we have provided over $4.5 billion in humanitarian assistance to Syria. This includes nearly $2.5 billion for aid inside Syria, almost $1 billion for UNHCR programs in Lebanon, and over $650 million to Jordan. We are enhancing military assistance to help our regional allies, including Jordan and Lebanon, repulse extremist threats from ISIL and Nusra. Thanks to General Allen's leadership, we are leading a global 65-member coalition working to degrade and defeat ISIL. Mr. Chairman, let me address head-on Russia's dangerous military intervention in Syria. Moscow deployed forces because its ally, the Assad regime, was losing territory, and even Iran's support was insufficient to protect it. Moscow has cynically tried to claim that its strikes are focused on terrorists, but so far 85 to 90% of Syrian strikes have hit the moderate Syrian opposition, and they have killed civilians in the process. Despite our urging, Moscow has yet to stop the Assad regime's horrific practice of barrel bombing the Syrian people. So we know that Russia's primary intent is to preserve the regime. In Vienna, Secretary Kerry brought together all those who can help in the conflict. Iran was invited for the practical reason that it is an active participant that needs to support a political transition. It will come as no surprise to you that this group disagreed on several subjects, most notably the fate of Assad. They did agree, however, to convene regime and opposition representatives on the basis of the Geneva Communique of 2012, which set out goals for the transfer of power to a transitional governing body and to explore modalities for a ceasefire in parallel with the political process. They also agree we must preserve Syria's unity and territorial integrity, ensure state institutions remain intact, protect the rights of all Syrians, assure humanitarian access, defeat ISIL and other terrorist groups designated by the UN Security Council, and establish a political process leading to a new constitution and elections administered under UN supervision and standards. We will convene parties at the ministerial level in the next few weeks to discuss next steps. Mr. Chairman, no one has any illusions about the difficulty of these efforts, but one thing is clear: Assad cannot unite and govern Syria, and we cannot continue to hold the lives of the Syrian people hostage to the desire of one man to retain power. We, the Syrian people, and our regional allies need a political transition that ends ISIL's reign of terror and allows displaced Syrians to return home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to take questions.
We go now to Ambassador Newland.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, members of this committee, for the opportunity to join you and my colleague, Assistant Secretary Ann Patterson, today. While Syria is in Assistant Secretary Patterson's area of responsibility, the conflict there increasingly imperils Turkey, the EU, and the rest of Europe as refugees stream out of Syria and head both north and south. Russia's new direct combat role in Syria has exacerbated an already dangerous refugee outflow, straining even the most generous Europeans' ability to cope. Turkey currently hosts 2.2 million refugees and by its account has invested over $8 billion towards their care and well-being. This year, the Turkish Coast Guard rescued an estimated 68,000 individuals attempting a dangerous sea voyage. Just since Russian combat operations began in Syria, Greece has recorded its highest level of migration flows per week, with an estimated 48,000 refugees and migrants crossing into the country in 1 week. The Western Balkans is also stretched thin from increased migration, primarily through Macedonia, Serbia, and Croatia. These countries report an average of 5,000 to 8,000 migrants passing through their borders daily. Germany's under strain. It's recorded over 577,000 arrivals just in the last 9 months. Inside Syria, just over the last month, while the Russians have been active, the United Nations reports at least 120,000 Syrians have been internally displaced as a result of the regime's attacks, aided by Russian airstrikes. 52,800 people were displaced from northern Hama and southern Idlib alone. These numbers validate what we already know and what you yourself, Chairman, pointed out. While Moscow asserts that its military actions are directed at ISIL, the vast majority of Russian airstrikes are targeted in areas where the Assad regime has lost territory to forces led by the moderate opposition: Hama, Homs, Aleppo, and Idlib. Now Russia's fielding its own artillery and other ground assets around Hama and Homs, greatly increasing Russia's own soldiers' vulnerability to counterattack. And Moscow has failed, as you said and as Assistant Secretary Patterson said, to exact any humanitarian concessions from the Assad regime as the price for Russian support. The regime continues to barrel bomb its own citizens with impunity, perhaps even emboldened by Moscow's help. None of this has been cost-free for Russia itself. In pure economic terms, the price of its air campaign is estimated at $2 to $4 million per day. This at a time when average Russians are feeling the pinch of recession brought on by economic mismanagement, low oil prices, and sanctions applied for the Kremlin's last military adventure in Ukraine. Russian casualties are also reportedly on the rise, although the Kremlin is again working overtime to mask them and silence the lust. And as the dumb bombs that Russia is dropping inevitably hit the wrong targets, a market, the Aleppo province, paying a very steep price to its reputation in the fight against terror. That's why, for now, we have limited our relation with Russia to the most basic of aviation deconfliction procedures to protect our own air crews. What would positive cooperation by Russia look like? First, Russia would turn its guns on ISIL and stop the carnage in and around Syria's western cities. As the price of its support, Moscow would insist that Assad ground the helicopters and planes that he's using to barrel bomb innocents on a daily basis. And it would urgently work with us, our allies, and UN envoy Staffan de Mistura to turn the statement of principles that Secretary Kerry, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and 17 other ministers and institutions released in Vienna last Friday into a true ceasefire, a parallel political transition process, and hasten the day that Assad's bloody tenure comes to an end. The quality of our cooperation with Russia in Syria depends on the choices that Moscow makes. In the meantime, as the Secretary has said, and as Assistant Secretary Patterson has outlined, we are accelerating the work we are doing to support the moderate Syrian opposition and to protect Syria's neighbors, including those in my area of responsibility, Turkey and the countries of Europe. Turkey has increased its own participation in the counter-ISIL fight, opening its bases to U.S. and coalition members and conducting its own airstrikes on ISIL targets inside Syria. As we accelerate our own work with Turkey and other like-minded partners to roll back ISIL in northern Syria, a collateral benefit could be the creation of a space where Syrian civilians are free from Assad's barrel bombs as well as ISIL's atrocities. A large number of Europeans have contributed aviation assets for strike operations in Iraq, and some are also considering strike operations in Syria. We're obviously also working with our allies and partners to address the refugee crisis. We've provided Turkey with over $325 million in assistance through the UN and private NGOs, and we've provided $26.6 million for UNHCR operations in Europe, including to help with food, water, legal assistance for refugees, including $600,000 now to respond to requests from Western Balkan countries for equipment and training in the area of border management. As the Secretary's diplomatic efforts make clear, it's going to take leadership and resolve by dozens of countries and by the Syrians themselves to end the bloodshed there. In Vienna last week, 17 assembled nations, the UN, and the EU reaffirmed the path forward to peace and a political transition. It remains to be seen whether Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime will join us in walking that path. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Newland. I mentioned my frustration with how the administration has approached Syria and ISIS. And the fact is that we had the State Department here, officials in front of this committee 2 years ago, sounding the ISIS alarm, explaining that action had to be taken. The Iraqis and our own officials pushed for airstrikes early on, and pushed for those airstrikes when ISIS was most vulnerable in Raqqa, in Syria. But the White House sat paralyzed. Once the airstrikes did start, and that's after a year of watching cities fall from Fallujah to Mosul and the central bank being taken over by ISIS. After that, we finally saw airstrikes averaging 19 a day, but in a circumstance in which three-quarters, because of exceedingly restrictive rules of engagement, three-quarters of those planes flew back to their bases without dropping their ordnance. If we compare that and consider the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, those airstrikes averaged 1,000 combat sorties per day, not 19. And now enter the Russians. The State Department said that this wouldn't impact our air mission over Syria, and yet the numbers that the committee put together say otherwise. In October, while the Russians did 800 airstrikes for the full month, mostly aimed, by the way, at the opposition, we managed just 100 against ISIS. Assistant Secretary Patterson, are we ceding the skies to Russia here? And in effect, allowing the ISIS threat to grow, because after all, ISIS has gained territory here during this time frame. So say the NGOs on the ground.
Mr. Chairman, obviously I'm not for DOD, but let me try and answer this question. Actually, this question came up at a very high-level meeting, and I will quote to you what a senior military officer said, which is, "We don't hit targets we can't see." And this was in reference to the very bad weather that had overtaken the area last week when the strikes were limited, and that we can't be compared to the Russians in any moral or operation or tactical sense. The battlefield, I might suggest, Mr. Chairman, is very different in a very complex battlefield mixed in with civilians. There are very high standards vis-a-vis collateral damage and civilian casualties that I would suggest the Russian Air Force is not subject to, and that we are appropriately subject to, which is different, very different than the first Gulf War and the mass of conventional forces. So that, I think, is at least a partial answer, Mr. Chairman, to your question.
Well, from the way I perceive it here, especially given my frustration with the first year of this conflict and not utilizing any air power when it could be very effective, we have a situation today where we're hitting the bad guys in this, ISIS, 100 times, and the Russians are hitting those that are opposed to ISIS and Assad 800 times. That's my takeaway in a broad sense of where we are now. But Ambassador Newland, this isn't just Russia reaching out to save an old ally. When we look at those remarks, we're seeing Russia and Iran work together in ways most had not expected. I certainly don't think the administration expected it. I don't think they expected we'd find Hezbollah fighters, and Iranian Quds forces and Russian headquarters, working together in this kind of a circumstance. But this was General Soleimani traveling to Moscow in the middle of our nuclear negotiations and putting this plan in place. Twice, as I understand it, he made that travel in violation, by the way, of the embargo. Again, something that wasn't objected to when I raised the issue that the head of the Quds forces, who, by the way, was responsible himself indirectly for the death of some 600 Americans, I'm told by the Pentagon, that he was in Moscow making arrangements with the Russians. There was no protest that I am aware of this being a violation of the travel ban. And of late, Russian aircraft have been seen running Iranian weapons into Syria. Again, that's a very clear violation of the embargo, which we all support. So what steps are being taken to uphold the UN arms embargo on Iran in the face of the Russian violations?
Mr. Chairman, I'm unaware of those reports, but let me, about the movement of Iranian arms into Syria on Russian aircraft, but we will certainly get you a report
Thank you.
as soon as possible.
I'm out of time. I will mention when Mr. Engel returns, he's at the White House. We'll give him ample time for his opening statement and for his questions. But in the meantime, I think Karen Bass of California is next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In light of the President's statement last week that we were deploying 50 special operation forces to Syria, I wanted to know what you see as their mission. Do you expect them to be engaged in direct combat? And how can we be sure that this limited deployment won't be a slippery slope to involve U.S. troops? I would join my colleague, Ms. Frankel, who said that had we not invaded Iraq years ago, that the whole region wouldn't be destabilized as it is now. But in light of that, I wanted to know if you could respond. I also want to ask you a couple of questions regarding the transitional government, a future transitional government in Syria.
Thank you. Let me say that I was in a briefing yesterday, and some of these responses on the activities and location of the special forces are classified.
Sure.
And so perhaps we will come back to you in a written answer on that. We would
Okay.
be very happy to do so. And their exact role is also a classified response. But let me also say that we're also deploying, as I mentioned in my statement, additional aircraft to Incirlik. The President is looking at a number of other options to intensify our efforts in this battle space.
In terms of the future transitional government in Syria, there were talks held in Vienna last week, and I wanted to know if you could talk about those. And in the future, what do you feel is the best way to compel the regime to a negotiated transition?
The
And that's
best
for
way-
either one of you.
Yes, let me give you an outline, if I might, a brief one of the Secretary's conversations in Vienna last week. He brought together 20 countries, including the Russians and the Iranians and our Gulf allies and the Turks, to discuss a way forward. And we agreed, obviously, to disagree on the future of Assad, but he did plot a way forward on a transitional government, constitutional reform, and a series of meetings and working groups that would take place with the international community, with the UN, and with the opposition to try and implement the Geneva Communique of 2012. The next meeting will likely be in Vienna within the next 2 weeks. There'll be a series of groups and consultations with the UN beforehand and with the opposition. The idea is to have a transitional government, to work on a timetable for Assad's departure, and let me be clear that that's a critical element of this policy, and then to work on constitutional review and ultimately an election in Syria. That's the basic outlines of Secretary Kerry's strategy.
So at this point, if there were to be a transitional government, who do you see composing that?
Well, a number of opposition figures and people already on the ground. It would be key, and this was in the communique, that Syria's institutions, the military, intelligence, police, civil service would remain intact, so you wouldn't have a total collapse of state authority. The idea is just to remove Bashar al-Assad
Like that happened in Iraq?
and his cronies from power.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Would my
Oh, yes,
colleague
go
yield?
ahead. Sure.
Ambassador Newland, what in the world makes us think Russia would agree to that? Why would Russia agree to a transitional government with opposition figures and the removal of Assad? And did you get that commitment?
Congressman, Russia did agree to that general framework in 2012 when it signed on to the original.
Well, that's before they started bombing and military activities on the ground. It's now 2015. You had a meeting in Vienna. Did the Russians agree?
So as Assistant Secretary Patterson has said, they have agreed to the general framework that we need a ceasefire, we need a transitional government, we need elections. The area of dispute is at what stage in that process Assad departs the scene.
Well, I must say, my time's up, but given what's happening on the ground, that sounds like fantasy to me.
Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much. Pardon me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing. Welcome to our two distinguished witnesses. Let me just ask a couple of questions. First, I chaired a hearing last week with the Helsinki Commission on refugees emanating or coming out of Syria. And the High Commissioner's special regional representative for the UNHCR testified, and his bottom line was that there were two big trends that have led to the mass exodus. One, a political solution will not be found anytime soon to the war. Secondly, that after so many years in exile, many people's resources have dwindled to next to nothing. But he said the third factor is the trigger. It is the raison d'etre why people have upstaked and have made their way into Europe. And he said the trigger was that a few months ago, there was a lack of funding for the World Food Program. They cut their assistance by 30%, and he testified and said, as a consequence, many refugees felt that the international community could be starting to abandon them. He plan for 2015 is only 41% funded. People are living on less than 50 cents a day, and he said they decided to go into flight in order, and my question would be, I know we are generous supporters of the WFP, and I am very glad that Congress and the administration has done that, but did we anticipate that this might be a trigger, that there was such a huge cut to the World Food Program? Secondly, let me ask, as Iran reaps its billions of dollars in windfall attributed to the Iranian nuclear deal, what is your assessment? And of course, this could be, you could provide this in a written form to elaborate on it, but what is your assessment of how that cash might be used to assist Assad? I also asked Assistant Secretary Richard last week about establishing a P2 program for especially minorities like the Yazidis and the Christians who really don't pose a threat. I know we have a very robust vetting process, as we ought to ensure that we don't have ISIS or any other al-Qaeda types embedded in the refugees that come here, but a P2 that targets people who are far less likely to be a threat to Americans. It seems to be something that I hope is on the table, being very actively discussed. I yield.
Mr. Smith, let me go through those as quickly as possible. On the question of the reduction in WFP assets, let me first say that we've done everything humanly possible to increase our contribution to WFP and to also solicit contributions from some of our more prosperous allies in the Gulf, who in truth have come through with an enormous amount of money, up to $2 billion for the Syrian refugees.
Now, is that, pardon my interruption, but is that getting to the people so they know?
Did we anticipate that it would be a trigger? I can't answer that, but we certainly anticipated that it would be a huge problem and deprive these people of desperately needed resources. So we're doing everything we can to beef up our humanitarian support. On the question of Iranian resources, I know this has been a frequent discussion with this committee and with other committees. The Iranian economy has been in free fall for the past several years because of sanctions. We believe there are huge pent-up needs in infrastructure, energy reconstruction, consumer demand that the Iranian government will have to meet, and Rouhani in particular, as an elected leader, will have to meet. But I don't want to be naive, Mr. Smith, that some of this money won't be used for the destabilizing activities of General Qasem Soleimani. And then finally, I know that you would ask my colleague Ann Richard that about the P2 program. And let me say, of course, that there is frankly a lot of concern, Mr. Smith, about people coming out of this area, that they are properly vetted and reviewed, given some of the history. But I know you've asked that, and believe me, it will certainly be under consideration, and we'll get you a staffed-out answer.
Mr. Bill Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I realize you're not speaking for the Department of Defense, as Assistant Secretary Patterson had mentioned. However, I just want to ask you if you've been at briefings and things you could disclose, because in open hearings with this committee and subcommittees, we've had witnesses, generals, military experts, time after time saying that the unilateral approach of just bombing itself would not be effective strategy, that it had to be accompanied by the ability, with troops in the ground, to hold that area that had bombed, or otherwise it was basically a worthless military strategy and approach. And so it brings me back to my opening comments, where I said simply bombing by itself, without the ability, whether it be through Sunni Arab troops or other troops on the ground, or in absentia, U.S. troops. The criticism about not continuing on that bombing aspect, it has to be incorporated with a land force complement. So are you familiar with those kind of discussions, Assistant Secretary?
Yes, Mr. Keating, those topics, as you suggest, are frequently discussed within the administration. And let me first say that I think the bombing campaign has had very considerable impact on the leadership of ISIL. I can get you the exact figures, but a number of prominent leaders have been essentially taken off the battlefield and removed from office.
Yeah, can I just jump into? Thank you. Can I just jump into this aspect? There's been a lot of discussion about rules of engagement, and it is a very difficult issue. But Russia is approaching this in a manner where, without discrimination, they seem contented bombing and killing innocent civilians. and not even trying to make efforts to avoid doing that, as opposed to the U.S. Policy, which takes that into consideration, as most countries in the world do. Can you comment on the importance of following rules of engagement to try, as the U.S. does, minimize civilian deaths?
Yes, Mr. Keating, as I mentioned, we have, particularly in this campaign, we have very strict, the U.S. Air Force has very strict rules of engagement on collateral damage, and that's accordance with the President's instructions, that our job is to minimize civilian casualties in every way possible. And it's not only, as might I mention, Mr. Keating, a moral issue, but it's also an issue of practicality, that you don't want to alienate, that the United States does not want to alienate the people on the ground. And if I might go back to your issue of the ground forces, let me also say that one of our goals now is to work with partners on the ground who can serve this role as ground troops in support of a U.S. Air campaign. We've supported, as you know, the Syrian Kurds and the Syrian Arabs, the Syrian Arab Coalition, and it's been very effective, I think, in closing the border, both to the influx of foreign fighters and to the export of refined products that provide revenue for
Is it fair to say, is it a fair statement to say that, not to categorize the Russian bombing actions as decisive, but rather immoral? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I would say that. I read yesterday rather graphic reports of the civilian casualties that they had inflicted on a village nearby. It seems quite indiscriminate, if I might say so.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. We go to Mr. Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. We're seeing a tremendous migration crisis in Europe as a result of the Syrian civil war and ISIS aggression in western Iraq and in Syria. This migration crisis is really threatening regional stability in Europe, really to the tune that we hadn't seen since probably the 1930s. It's mind-boggling when you watch the videos of the number of migrants streaming into Eastern European countries and now Western European countries. I just have a question for Ambassador Nuland. Ambassador Colleen Bell works for you, does she not? Okay. Ambassador to Hungary, for the record?
Yes.
You were also ambassador to NATO, so you understand the key role that NATO countries play with security of the world and with cooperating with the United States, correct? Hungary is a very valuable ally, NATO ally, are they not? So why then, after months of seemingly improved relations between Hungary, a Western democracy, and a NATO ally, as we've just confirmed, did the U.S. ambassador decide to launch an unprovoked attack on Hungary last week? You're familiar with what Ms. Bell said, correct?
Congressman, I'm not sure specifically what comments of hers you may be referring to. She gave a speech last week where she reaffirmed U.S. support for a Hungary that is increasingly democratic. We have had concerns about government policy with regard to attacking corruption. We've had concerns about repression of media. I think she was probably, if it's the speech I'm...
She chastised the sovereign nation's ability to secure its own borders and put fencing up if they so chose. Did she not?
Again, I would have to go back and look at precisely what she said. We have had concerns, as has the EU as a whole, about EU member states erecting fences against EU policy between each other. We have instead tried to support the policy of the EU as a whole to work together and to be in solidarity with each other in addressing the migrant crisis by registering.
I mean, I disagree. I disagree with some of that based on what she said. So the question to you is our diplomatic mission not to improve relations with our allies, or is it one to scold those we need in NATO in order to meddle in their domestic affairs while stroking whatever egos are satisfied by such actions? Is that our diplomatic mission there?
Congressman, even with our NATO allies, it's been the longstanding one might argue, 50-year policy of the United States to support an increasingly democratic, stable, clean Europe. So when we have concerns that a country is not attacking corruption in its midst, when we have concerns about the rollback of the democratic principles that undergird NATO membership, we're going to speak out about it, yes.
Madam Ambassador, I disagree that I do think you're meddling in the affairs of a sovereign nation. When we look at the mass migration that's coming across Europe, are you going to interfere and chastise Germany if they decide to deal with the migrants that are affecting their nation? Are you going to chastise Slovenia or some of the other nations who are having to deal with this? They're having to deal with these huge, almost 1 million migrants have made their way into Eastern and now Western Europe. It's an issue, a crisis for them. The demographics is going to change the political atmosphere in those countries. These are sovereign nations that are going to have to deal with this. It's going to be a strain on their social programs, on their ability to do things for their own citizens. The demands being placed on them by these migrants, it's a game changer in Europe. Is the U.S. policy one to interfere with sovereign nations in Europe and their ability to provide services for their own citizens and deal with the migration crisis? Is that the policy of the administration?
On the contrary, Congressman, we are strongly supportive of the overall EU policy that they are putting in place now, which is to support each other in resettling these migrants appropriately and treating them tolerantly, in sharing the burden, in contributing to host country, in providing more funds to those countries where refugees are coming from.
My time's just about up, Madam Ambassador. So
when they start rebuilding walls between themselves and among themselves in contradiction of EU policy,
I would
we're gonna
recommend that
support
you
those
listen to
who
Ms.
support.
Bill's statements, and we have a retraction on that. Now yield back.
We go now to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. I think you're just hearing some frustration. Not to take this personally from anyone, but thank you. First of all, I just want to say and applaud. I think the administration, the president, Mr. Kerry, trying to get as many of the relevant world leaders together to try to come to grips with what's going on in Syria is going in the right direction. That is a good step. It sounds to me that you, from comments, especially, I forget which one of you said this, but it sounds to me that it's your opinion that Russia's actions in Syria are such that it'll be self-destructive. I think that's what I gleaned from your comments. But in the meantime, before Russia self-destructs themselves with what they're doing, there's so many innocent people who are being harmed. So my question is, what kind of strategies or actions are you taking with Russia that can maybe change their course? That's my first question. Second is, what are we doing to actually protect the Syrian civilians within Syria? And are there any further plans, or is it hopeless to do a safe zone or a no-fly zone, or is anything else being considered that we have not heard about?
Ms. Frankel, let me say that first that we don't think this is a slam dunk from the Russians by any means. They have basically got the whole Sunni world against them now, and I think it's an analytical fact that we may not have seen anything yet in terms of jihad, because we've already seen imams in the Gulf call for increased jihad against the godless Russian presence in Syria. So I won't say they've bitten off more than they can chew, but they certainly have issues that they're going to confront, not the least of which is their huge Islamic population inside and on the perimeter of Russia. Vis-a-vis the civilians inside Syria, Ms. Frankel, Of course, half the assistance is provided, our humanitarian assistance to the tunes of billions of dollars provided to Syrians within Syria. Of course, there are zones we can't reach. But in terms of safe zones, and I'm glad you asked this because there's been a lot of discussion about this. This is a hugely complex and resource-intensive issue. And the administration has looked at this over and over and over again, and there is no option on the table, nor recommended by the Department of Defense, that does not require a massive amount of air support that would then detract from the effort against ISIL. We continue to look at this, we continue to study this, but there is no viable option on the table at this time.
Ambassador Nuland, did you have anything to add?
Simply to say that we've been very clear with the Russians about what we're seeing in terms of the results of their strikes. The Secretary's spoken to Foreign Minister Lavrov virtually every day, also about our insistence that they exact some kind of restraint out of Assad for the support that they're giving, at least in the area of barrel bombing. And we will continue to share not only with the Russians directly, but with all of you and publicly what we see. I think as Assistant Secretary Patterson said, what the Secretary's hope is here is that if you rope them into this diplomacy, they will see a better way to a peaceful solution than what they're doing.
And just one more question. I think we all have heard that the conditions for the Syrian refugees are dire, especially at the borders. I heard stories yesterday that were, my hair would go up straight if it could do that. But it sounded horrible. What kind of actions are you taking? I mean, I heard people living out in the open, no sanitation, very little food. What's the response?
Ms. Franco, occasionally the neighboring countries close the border, and these poor people get caught in these pockets. Usually that's short-lived, and the countries will open the border again, and so we work with them constantly on that issue to get these refugees into their countries. Most of these countries are hosting these refugees in host communities, and it puts a very significant strain on their public services, which is not an education, which is why support from the international community and continued financial support is so important.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. Okay, Mr. Darrell Issa of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ambassador. Subject du jour, Syria. 14 years ago, I made my first trip to Syria to meet with the unknown President Assad. He's been pretty well defined over 14 years, and the Alawite dictatorship he heads has been pretty well defined over many decades. So let me ask a question, and Ambassador Patterson, I think I'll primarily frame it to you. More than 4 years ago, this administration called for regime change and not only did very little to make that come about, but then directly and through the Russians negotiated various agreements, including obviously the chemical weapons departure. At this point, isn't it time to ask the question of what do we really want to achieve in Syria, since, one, the so-called Free Syrian Army has cost us some incredible number that I'm not even going to say on television again, because it has been a complete failure. We have no Free Syrian Army. More Sunnis are fighting independent of us than with us by a factor of probably 1,000 to 1. So let me ask you it in a succinct way. Ambassador, isn't it time we figure out what is possible in a Syria that allows the millions of Syrians, Sunni, Shia, Alawite, Christian, to return to their country?
Mr. Issa, we don't believe it's possible to have any sort of settlement there, either a political settlement or any military defeat of ISIL without the departure of Assad. These two issues now are inexorably linked. He has turned out to be, as you know, a magnet for terrorists all over the world, particularly, well, for many countries, even including our own. I guess I would differ from you that the Free Syrian Army has been a bust. I think there are efforts underway that have corralled, and I know that you're aware of these efforts underway that have corralled our Gulf allies and our European allies in a common effort in Syria. So I think there's really no alternative but to talk about his departure.
And Ambassador, I'm not for a moment trying to predetermine the departure of Bashar Assad. I happen to agree with you that a future Syria should be a Syria with greater Sunni representation, with rights of Christians respected, and that he is probably not the ideal. He is a failed leader in many ways, and I think history has already borne that out. But my question, and the reason I'm asking it this way, is if I were to ask you, do we have an effective battalion of Free Syrian military, you'd have to say no. If I said, do we have an effective company, you'd have to say no. If I asked if we had an effective platoon, you'd say, well, we've got a platoon, but it's not quite effective. And I just left the Marines' 240th birthday, and trust me, if I sent Marines in to evaluate those people, they would come up short of effective for any of them. And it's been 4 years. Isn't it true that the effective forces against Assad today are in fact non-ISIS fighters who disagree but are not aligned with us? In other words, Sunnis who oppose Assad, who are being bombed by the Russians as we speak.
That's true in the north, Mr. Issa. I would say that it's not true in the south. But certainly in the north, Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate, has absorbed, as have other smaller groups, have absorbed a number of what we would have previously called the moderate opposition. Yes, that's correct. It's not true in the south, Mr. Issa, where I believe the moderate fighters are holding their own and holding territory.
Well, and let's go to the moderate fighters in the south and the effect on Lebanon for just a moment, which is the lead question people always assume I'll ask. Today in Lebanon, it's been widely reported, unclassified, that in fact the sectors that are being protected in Lebanon from ISIS are in fact a combination of the Lebanese armed forces wherever possible and Hezbollah in many of the Shia areas, essentially protecting their own. Is that a workable solution, and is the United States able to ensure that the Lebanese armed forces continues to get what they need, while not unreasonably emboldening Hezbollah for the future?
Mr. Issa, I think the Lebanese armed forces have, under the circumstances, done nothing short of a remarkable job in protecting Lebanon. We have tried to increase the flow of material to them. We have, as you know, a robust training program by some of our highly trained American forces, and we have worked particularly with the Saudis to get them some additional funds to buy military equipment. It is an extremely high priority. I think they just had an encounter with ISIL day before yesterday, but they've done and contrary to many expectations, it seems to be working.
Well, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity on Syria, and I want to thank the Ambassador for pointing out the success, which is Lebanon hosting nearly a third of its population as refugees while keeping ISIS out of that country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Issa, for making that point. Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ambassadors, for being here today, for your testimony, and most of all, for your service to the country. And my first question is on migration. What effect has the Russian bombing campaign had on the flow of migrants, whether it's changed it, whether it's increased it? What's our read on that?
Congressman Castro, as I said in my opening, we believe that it has led to an acceleration of migrants into Europe in particular. We've seen those upticks in Greece, in Turkey, into Germany just since the Russian bombing.
And have we found that the migrants intend to stay in Europe or want to come back? What's our understanding of that?
With regard to Syrians, what we're getting from our European friends is that it's a mixed picture. You know, those who have hope that their country can come back together have left, some relatives there and property, but many of them have lost hope and are looking for permanent resettlement in Europe, which is a question that Europe is struggling with.
Sure. And what about our Gulf partners? What role have they played with respect to migration and refugees?
Our Gulf partners have been generous with funding. The Kuwaitis in particular have hosted 3 funding donors conferences, given hundreds of millions of dollars, the United Arab Emirates as well. Perhaps the question you're asking is on the resettlement. The Gulf countries do not take in refugees. What they do is take in basically guest workers, and a number of the Gulf countries have a large number of Syrian employees, really, but you cannot say that they are refugees, but they have been generous with their money.
And my second question is on the use of chemical weapons. Of course, in 2013, Russia agreed to essentially extract the chemical weapons from Syria, and Syria is now bound by the Chemical Weapons Convention. What kind of use of chemical weapons have we seen in Syria, specifically with regard to chlorine gas?
We believe that we have seen chlorine gas. It would be a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, of which, of course, Syria is a signatory. We have referred it to the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and they are going to do an analysis in the report. Once we receive that, we will decide what steps to take.
Have we determined that it's the Assad regime that's using the chemical weapons, or could it be other actors as well?
Our strong judgment is it's the Assad regime, because they were seemingly dropped from helicopters, which are not in the possession of the opposition.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. Now we go to Mr. Mo Brooks of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your opinion, is Russia's use of military force in Syria good or bad, productive or counterproductive?
Congressman Brooks, I think we've been pretty clear here that we do not think that Russia's military intervention is leading to a settlement of the Syrian conflict, that instead it is giving Assad confidence that he can stay in power.
Using words such as immoral to describe how bad Russia's conduct in Syria is that fair?
Assistant Secretary Patterson confirmed that word, and I don't have a problem with it either.
What thought has been given to using a diversion strategy whereby we force the Russian military to be engaged in different parts of the globe, thereby weakening their abilities to prosecute their military aggression in Syria? More specifically, how would a more aggressive military action in the Ukraine impact Russia's limited ability to expand its military operations in the Middle East? And by military action, I'm talking about where we arm the Ukrainians, thereby forcing the Russians to divert some of their military capabilities from Syria and other parts of the globe to Ukraine to try to protect the territory that they have either unlawfully invaded themselves or assisted their proxies in unlawfully invading.
Congressman, I think you know that we've had a ceasefire in Ukraine that has largely been holding, not completely, but largely been holding since September 1st. I'm confident that you would not be suggesting here that the Ukrainians reignite the war to draw the Russians deeper into conflict there. I don't think that would be good for Ukraine or for the stability of Europe.
Well, is this ceasefire in actuality just a way in which the Russians and their proxies can consolidate their territorial gains? Is that putting Ukraine in a position where they have to forfeit hopes of recapturing the land wrongfully taken by Russia and its proxies?
Congressman, under the Minsk agreement, as you know, the first step is ceasefire, the second step is pullback of weapons, then political progress in the Donbass, and then return of the territory and closure of the border. So what we are now starting to see for the first time in the 2 years of this conflict is some pullback of Russian and separatist weapons. So that is a good thing. We are seeing that in Luhansk, and now we're starting to see that in Donetsk, even though the ceasefire is not complete and we've had some tactical attacks in the last couple of days. So again, if you want Ukraine to get that territory back, if you want Minsk implemented, what's most important is to to lean on Russia and the separatists to complete those obligations, pull back their weapons, and allow real elections and allow return of the border?
Well, as of today, given the shifting of military equipment, has any of the territory taken by Russia or its proxies been returned to the government of the Ukraine? Any significant amount of territory? And if you could, if you're going to be able to answer that, give us all an idea as to how much, what percentage of territory has been returned to the Ukraine after Russia's invasion, and how much has been kept in the hands of the Russians, keeping in mind that the Crimea itself is a rather large landmass.
So about 7% of Ukraine, if you count Crimea plus the occupation of eastern Ukraine, is lost to the control of the Ukrainian government. As I said, with this ceasefire and the beginning of pullback of heavy weapons, Ukrainian authorities have not had access to that territory, but increasingly OSCE monitors have had access, and we need to encourage and accelerate that process. If we can get
One second. So is your answer to the question zero?
Zero.
As of today, zero land has been returned to the Ukrainian government.
As of today, zero.
How much in the way of weapons has the United States delivered to the Ukrainian government in order to enhance Ukraine's ability to defend its territory?
Congressman, through bipartisan generosity of both halves of this Congress, we have supplied over $266 million in security support for Ukraine. That includes extensive training of the National Guard, now moving on to training the military. We've provided lots of kinds of non-lethal assistance, including UAVs.
I'm talking about weaponry. What weaponry has been given to the Ukrainian government to enable it to defend its territory or to recapture territory taken by Russia?
It depends how you define weaponry, but we've provided counter-radar batteries, including short-range and now longer-range ones.
Any missiles?
UAVs. We have not provided lethal assistance to date.
No tanks?
No, but we have provided combat vehicles like Humvees, night vision, combat protection, et cetera.
Mr. Chairman, with indulgence, may I have 30 more seconds?
Yes, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you. The reason I mention this is due to the leadership of Congressman Engel, who is not here at the moment, of New York. The House passed a resolution in March of this year by a 348-48 vote, about an 88% to 12% bipartisan vote, which is overwhelming in the United States House of Representatives and to some degree a little bit unusual. And that resolution of the House of Representatives in an overwhelming bipartisan fashion stated, quote, that the House of Representatives strongly urges the President to fully and immediately exercise the authorities provided by Congress to provide Ukraine with lethal defensive weapon systems to enhance the ability of the people of Ukraine to defend their sovereign territory from the unprovoked and continuing aggression of the Russian Federation. I would hope that you would carry back to this administration that message with a double benefit. One is we help Ukraine fight against aggression, and two, I would submit that it weakens Russia and Syria, which in turn helps to alleviate some of the problems that we have there. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. About 10,000 ISIS fighters have been killed this past year, but it seems like despite that, they've been replaced by new recruits, new fighters. If we are going to destroy them, how do we cut off those new fighters, those new recruits?
That's a big challenge, Congresswoman, and let me tell you the steps that are being taken. First, there's a step through under General Allen's leadership, who regrettably he's soon to leave the position. We've developed a number of working groups with our allies, for instance, with the United Arab Emirates, to try and message, to try and get to these young men and persuade them that ISIL isn't a viable future. We have worked with the Turkish government, Ambassador Nuland can speak more to that, to close the border. And again, most of the border now is closed. We've worked with them to deport individuals who try and cross over into Turkey, into Syria. We have worked with our Gulf allies, again, to increase their message and their surveillance of individuals who might undertake extremist activities in Syria. But it's a big challenge, Congresswoman, because ISIL has managed to tap into Sunni grievances in a very big way. But we continue to press on this. I believe we're having some modest success, but obviously that's key to restraining the growth of ISIL.
What do you think about even the Americans going over? Have we had success in decreasing those amounts?
I think all told, Congresswoman, there are really just a handful of Americans, and I think frankly, our law enforcement agencies and the communities that they work with, I think that's the key in the United States, is to have good relations in these communities, who then will alert law enforcement to a young man, mostly young men who are susceptible to these blandishments. But it's and the use of the internet and the sophistication of these messages is very alarming. But I think as time goes on, we're getting better and better about understanding the counter message and how the counter message differs by culture and by country.
We don't talk much about the al-Nusra Front in Syria. What's our strategy to deal with that group of fighters?
The al-Nusra Front is an al-Qaeda affiliate. They're a designated terrorist organization. They have been successful on the battlefield in the north, and they have absorbed some, what I would call, non-extremist fighters, because their own groups have been affected and because they essentially have nowhere else to go. So our strategy is that they are a terrorist group. They will not be part of any political settlement that is developed over time.
I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Would my friend yield? I thank my friend. Ambassador Nuland, I want to go back to the understandings with Russia. We had this meeting with 20 countries. The Secretary pulled together. Russia was there. Russia's been violating Turkish airspace. Was there a discussion at that meeting and an understanding that Russia will cease and desist against our NATO ally?
The day of the Russian incursion into Turkish airspace, Secretary called Foreign Minister Lavrov immediately. As you know, the NATO alliance also issued a strong statement of support for Turkey.
And did you get an assurance from the Russians they would cease and desist, was my question.
My understanding is that the Turks have now sought and gotten a reassurance from the Russians that they will cease and desist.
But not us in the
But it
Vienna
remains-
meeting that we called together.
Well, we've made clear that it is unacceptable to be incurring NATO airspace.
And did we do that in Vienna? Did we get any kind of assurance from the Russians?
Again, they have made clear to us that they do not intend to do it again, but obviously we have to watch what they do rather than what they say.
Do we have any understanding in terms of rules of engagement with the Russians in terms of their military activities in Syria? This hearing is about Russia's escalation in Syria.
Congressman, in terms of direct negotiations, as you know, the Department of Defense conducted a very limited air deconfliction exercise with the Russians. We have an agreement on safe flight, which we have now tested, but we are not collaborating with them on where they can be and where we can be.
No, my question isn't collaboration. It is rules of engagement to make sure that there is not an inadvertent collision between our Air Force and theirs, our counselors and theirs and the like.
That was the goal of this agreement, this memorandum of understanding that we have now concluded, that we will stay away from each other. We have emergency hotline, we have emergency communications.
So they're in place.
To protect
Okay.
our pilots, particularly because of the kind of flying that they do.
Thank you, and I thank my colleague for yielding.
We go to Mr. Randy Weber of Texas.
Before I begin, Mr. Chairman, let me tell my friend Jerry Connolly, I'm not going to yield to you. You've got more time than all of us combined. Just kidding, Jerry. Ambassador Nuland, let me follow up with...
Were you yielding? No.
Ambassador Patterson, let me follow up with your exchange with Congressman Keating when he said that some of the generals had said the air war wouldn't do it at all, and you said you had been involved in those conversations. Do you recall that exchange earlier today? Is the President aware of those conversations?
The President and our senior leadership meet very frequently on these issues, of course.
How long have those conversations been going on?
Quite a while, Mr. Weber.
A year, two?
Easily.
Okay. Just curious. Ambassador Nuland, you said that Russia was spending $2.5 million per day on their military excursion into the Ukraine. I'm sorry, and well, we don't know what it is into the Ukraine, but into Syria. How long can they sustain that?
What I said was 2 to 4 million a day, just to be clear, and it may well be more than that. You know, in a country like Russia, where there's only one prime decision maker, if Russia chooses to make this a priority over the welfare of its own people, it could sustain it for some time.
So you've not calculated that. What is the U.S.'s outlay of expense on a day, or on a day? Do we know that?
I'm dated, Mr. Weber, but the last time I asked, it was about $8 million a day.
So 4 times, or if you use the 2 to 4 times the amount Russia's using, but we're getting 1/8 the amount of airstrikes. Is that what I'm to understand?
Mr. Weber, that would include Iraq, the entire air campaign, but again, we're not the Russians.
Okay.
And we have different standards.
All right. And then you said earlier, it might have been Ambassador Newland, that the Gulf countries were not taking any refugees, but they've been very generous with their money. Was that you, Ambassador Patterson?
That's right, Mr. Weber. I have the list of.
Okay, well, I'm fascinated by my colleague Mo Brooks' idea of arming those in the Ukraine to maybe divert some of Russia's attention to increase maybe to help defend Ukraine and to increase Russia's expense and cost and maybe deflect them some from Syria. If the Gulf countries are, as one of you said, I think you said it was you, are very generous with their money, would they help in that regard to arm some of the Ukrainians against the Russians? Has that question been raised to them?
As far as I know, that question has never arisen, Mr. Weber.
How about the question, why won't they take refugees?
Because they have very different types of societies. And I know that.
But they do want their society to continue as they know it, right? And if ISIL overruns their societies, it'll be gone.
Yes, and we have a very close degree of intelligence and military cooperation with our GCC Gulf Cooperation partners, GCC partners on cyber, on military, on intelligence. We have a very close relationship. So yes, we work closely in anti-ISIL activity.
But they could put up temporary camps if they're concerned about their society, tent cities, if you will, and they could actually take refugees and house them and feed them, probably with a lot more money than some of the European nations. Wouldn't you agree? If they were willing?
I'm not sure that's true, actually, because the level of social services and infrastructure is vastly better in Europe. But of course, we do want the Gulf to play a more active role, and we do encourage them, and we do want them to provide funding for these activities.
Okay. Now, what happens, and Jerry Connolly asked the question about what if there was a problem between the United States aircraft and the Russian aircraft. In your opinion, what's going to happen when the Russian aircraft drops, the Russian military drops a bomb on some of our 50 advisors over there? What happens?
Well, we have these deconfliction procedures in place, as Ambassador Newland just outlined, these deconfliction procedures that were designed to avoid any conflict between Russian.
If that happens, would our pilots be authorized to shoot that plane down that dropped the bomb? Ambassador Newland, do you have any knowledge?
Without getting into classified information, I would simply say that where we anticipate these special operators being, the Russians have been very far from that territory because, as you know, these special operators are would be operating against ISIL, and our concern is that Russia is operating in support of Assad.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. I yield back.
Dr. Ami Berra of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to play off some of the comments that my colleague from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, talked about. Our goal is to defeat and destroy ISIL. And it's clear that we don't have the forces, but we have had some success in terms of the forces on the ground. I think Ms. Kelly pointed out that the anti-ISIL coalitions killed about 10,000 ISIS fighters. And part of our challenge is that they're being replaced. And we can have success, but some of it is stopping the replacement. I think Ambassador Patterson, you talked about doing what we can at the borders, certainly, doing what we can, tracking the fighters that are leaving Europe, leaving some of the North African countries, some of the Middle Eastern countries, and even some of the Western states. I do think we're losing the propaganda war, though, right? I think ISIL has shown to be able to use the internet very efficiently, social media very efficiently, and maybe Ambassador Patterson, this is a question for you. Are we doing enough to counter this propaganda war to slow down their ability to recruit?
This is a big challenge, but I think we're getting better at it. For instance, we have a joint center with the United Arab Emirates, and it has to be in Arabic and it has to be in an Arab country because it's and they've begun to put out products that are designed to discourage mostly young men from joining ISIL. We're working with a broad range of, under General Allen's coalition, we have a working group on messaging. And we have now a very large operation at the State Department and with the intelligence community that works on designing the most appropriate message for these individuals. So I think we're making progress. We're also making progress. Let me take Tunisia. Tunisia has the most jihadis per capita of any country in the world. But in the past year, we've worked intensively with them on intelligence issues and counter messaging and training religious leaders to counter that message. So again, I certainly don't want to overstate this, but I think we've gotten better and are making at least some marginal progress.
I think I'd echo, the chairman has certainly led us on a number of hearings here. We've got to redouble our efforts on the propaganda war, because if we can stop it on the front end, we won't have to fight them on the battlefield. And I do think we are losing that front-end propaganda war through social media and the internet. Ambassador Nuland, I'd agree with you very much so that Russia's involvement is very counterproductive, is exacerbating an already challenging situation in Syria, and certainly is escalating the refugee crisis, and does threaten to wreak havoc in some of our allies, Jordan, Turkey. You're seeing our European allies struggle with this refugee crisis. I know there has been some discussion, and it's not easy, but creating a safe zone within Syria, and a no-fly zone within Syria, where some of the Syrians that are fleeing some of the conflict zones can go. I'd be curious about what it would take to potentially create that zone, or Ambassador Patterson, whoever.
It would take at least it would take a massive commitment of air power, it would take a massive commitment of air power, and it would detract the air assets from the fight against ISIL. There's no option, Congressman, that's been put on the table so far within the administration that's considered viable because of the enormous resources that it would require to protect the population within it.
Okay, great. Again, I think. Is that an option that's being discussed? Again, not an easy option. Nothing about Syria is easy here. It's
constantly being discussed, and it's constantly under review, but that's the current status of it.
Okay, great. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barra. We now go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen, our Chairman Emeritus.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, ambassadors. I continue to be extremely frustrated by the administration's inability to implement or even articulate a strategy in Syria or in Middle East as a whole. Despite the public facade, it does not appear that the president really wants Assad removed from power, or that we have any understanding of the long-term tragic impact that Assad's policies are having on the Syrian people, on the region, our allies, on our national security, or else we know it and don't wish to do anything about it. Do we really need additional evidence to prove that the current chaos is not working? The president seems to be running out the clock until it's someone else's problem, and I don't think history will look kindly on the choices that this administration has made on the Syria issue. Some questions for you, and I would like to get yes and no answers if I could. Do you believe that ISIL and Assad are separate issues?
No, at this point, Ms.
Thank you.
West-Layton, and they're linked.
And do you agree that Assad's atrocities against his own people are a recruiting tool for ISIL?
Absolutely.
Is it possible to defeat ISIL while Assad's massacres continue with Iran and Russia's help?
No, the two issues are linked.
Is it possible to negotiate a solution with the opposition while they continue?
Possibly.
Are we pressuring Iran and Russia to stop Assad's massacre?
Absolutely, on a daily basis.
Should we infer that the president agrees more with Russia and Iran's goal of keeping Assad in power than he would have us believe?
Certainly not. The presidents and certainly the secretary have said many times that Assad's departure is absolutely critical to any future in Syria.
What has the president and the White House, through the Secretary of State, communicated to you about the administration's desired and end state and national security objectives in Syria? And is it possible to achieve those goals when Russia and Iran's goals are the complete opposite?
The secretary, of course, we have different goals in Syria, but I think the secretary's goal is to find sufficient common ground through a process of negotiation and a political settlement that we might be able to find a way through this. He's not naive about this. This is what the whole Vienna process and follow-up process is about.
And when you say common ground and a political settlement, does that entail keeping Assad in power?
No, absolutely not, but it might entail some negotiation on a timetable for his departure.
And we would be working with who to try to achieve that settlement, to have him go somewhere else?
We're working with, in the Vienna process, are 20 different countries. Obviously, our Gulf allies and the Turks are intimate, the Turks are intimately involved with this, as are some of our European allies. And we're constantly in touch with the UN and members of the moderate opposition and armed opposition within Syria and those civilian leaders in exile.
And if those allies, do they see Assad's removal from power as imperative to deal with this situation?
Certainly our European allies, our Gulf allies and Turkey do see that. They're absolutely determined that he will not remain in power.
And to follow up on Ms. Frankel's questions, there's a lot of talk in different communities that we represent about whether the United States is doing enough to protect Syrian civilians from the Assad regime. Is that still one of the priorities of this administration, and how is that priority manifested?
Certainly, we try. We've provided over $2.5 billion for humanitarian assistance inside Syria. So we're certainly trying to feed and support Syrian populations who are under great stress. And we've certainly, as you mentioned, raised before, we have certainly talked with the Russians about preventing Assad from attacking his own people.
And the bombs that we have seen that have been attacking some of the forces with whom we are dealing and we are protecting and we are arming, and yet some of those airstrikes seem to be targeting the very folks who are supposed to be the good guys in this battle. What are we doing to make sure that that ends?
That's absolutely true, Congresswoman. We mentioned, I think, that 85 to 90% of the strikes were against anti-regime forces. And on your second question, we can talk more about that in a classified setting.
And just one last question. I know I'm out of time. There's been a lot of discussion in the open press about like-minded factors like the Nusra Front being part of this coalition that will then defeat another band of bad guys? Are we in that coalition building with folks who we would normally see as our enemies and the enemies of our values?
Nusra Front is an al-Qaeda affiliate. It is possible that some members of the opposition have been forced to adhere to join to al-Nusra because they had nowhere else to go. But al-Nusra Front and its leadership are terrorist groups.
And we will remain with that thinking and not help those groups with their alliances with other.
No, we have designated Nusra.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Eliana. We go now to David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here and, of course, for your service. But I have to tell you, I remain very concerned that the absence of a coherent strategy for success in Syria and Iraq to defeat ISIL and further complicated by Russian escalation and really a failure to define what success is continues to really plague us in Syria. And, of course, the best way to press the administration and Congress to do this is to vigorously debate an authorization for the use of military force, during which the president would be required to articulate a strategy and to persuade both the American people and Congress of the likelihood of success of that strategy. And I recognize this is complicated. There are not easy answers. But I think it's compounded, frankly, Ambassador Patterson. In your written testimony, you indicate that our strategy in the Syrian conflict remains the same, essentially using diplomacy and military action to achieve a political transition. Of course, that's not a strategy. That's a goal. And so I think what we're really looking for and what we need is a detailed plan of action with, goals and a plan to mobilize resources to achieve those goals. That's really a strategy. And I think that's really what we're missing and what I think is critical. But I want to ask some very specific questions. You said, Ambassador Patterson, in your testimony that the coalition has made progress in our military campaign against ISIL. But according to Al Arabiya, as of October of this year, ISIL controls half of all of the territory in Syria, as opposed to July 2014, when they controlled about a third of Syrian territory. So first, is that correct, that ISIL, in fact, controls more territory now than they did in the summer of 2014? And if so, how is that progress?
I think they may control more land territory, but certainly there has been progress against ISIL in Tikrit and Beji, in the efforts in Ramadi. And again, there's been considerable progress against the leadership. The top of my head, I think 60 leaders of ISIL, including some very important ones, have been taken off the battlefield. The effort by special forces against Abu Sayyaf, who was a leader of ISIL, and against his wife, was an intelligence bonanza. So there has been progress, but I, as the president and everybody else has said, this is obviously going to be a multi-year campaign that's going to require considerable resources to prosecute.
With respect to the moderate opposition, there's been a lot of discussion about supporting the moderate opposition, and that appears to be at least a tactic in our Syrian response. Who is the moderate opposition? The president has just authorized another $100 million expenditure, so now totaling $500 million. There are reports that there are as many as 1,000 armed militia groups, and that much of the success of the larger groups, the FSA, comes about as a result of working alongside some of the most hardline groups. So who are we talking about when we're speaking about moderate opposition, and do they in fact include elements of al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and other more extremist groups?
Well, let me take the civilian moderate opposition too, and that's the assistance figure that you're referring to. And that's groups within Syria and groups that live in Turkey and Lebanon and other places. And what that project is designed to do is to keep these people not only alive physically, but also keep them viable for a future Syria. Because we have managed to, even areas under control of ISIL, I won't mention them, but we have managed to provide money to city councils, to health clinics, to teachers and policemen, so these people can still provide public services and form the basis for a new Syria. So that's a good portion of that money goes into efforts like that. There's also the opposition on the ground. And I think they've sort of gotten a bum rap in this hearing because I think they're more extensive than is generally recognized, particularly in the South. And they, yes, of course, in the North, some of these individuals have affiliated with Nusra because there was nowhere else to go. But I think there are a wide range of moderate commanders that we've worked with closely, and I think they are viable and will be able to play a part in the future of Syria.
Ambassador Patterson, and finally, the President obviously has just announced 50 special forces will be dispatched to Syria to advise and assist Kurdish forces in that region. Can you tell me what the end goal of this is? What's the objective? How can we be sure that this limited deployment doesn't begin a very slippery slope and a wider, deeper military engagement in the Syrian civil war? And finally, you mentioned the financial support of the Gulf nations for the refugees. We've heard from a number of refugee organizations that there is not sufficient financial support from Gulf countries. I know you mentioned Qatar, but are there other countries in the Gulf that are not doing as much as they should? Because we're hearing a very different representation from refugee organizations that are charged with actually dealing with the crisis on the ground.
Let me provide you right after this hearing with a list of support I have from the Gulf. I think some of the traditional refugee agencies, there's not enough money. There's simply not enough money for this enormous humanitarian catastrophe. Let me stress that. But I think the Gulf nations have both been generous with the UN, and often their money is put through local Red Crescent societies, their local NGOs and PVOs. And so perhaps there's some concern about that they're not going through international, the big international NGOs. But I will provide you with that.
And what about the 50?
On the 50, we talked a lot about the strategy of ground support and working with partners. These 50 special forces are to work with the Syrian Arab coalition, which has had considerable success in closing the border, and to improve their capacity. And I think anything else we'll provide it to you in a classified letter.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much. And let me just say that in perspective, I am very frustrated by talk about Russia. And I spent my entire life trying to defeat the Soviet Union. And I was very pleased to be part of the Reagan administration that helped accomplish that goal of bringing down a regime that wanted to impose an atheist dictatorship throughout the world in order to promote their ideology. And Russians expected to be treated as friends, the Russian people, after the fall of communism. And what has risen instead is a hostility that is just so overwhelming that it is damaging, not only has been damaging Russia and their ability to establish themselves in a new world role, because it is, after all, a major power in the world. And they have interest, no matter if they're not communist at all, they are a major power with interest, just as we are. But the double standard that we have been judging Russia, and even as present in the hearing today, is just overwhelming. We sit here and say, oh, well, Russia wants to keep Assad in power. How horrible that is, because Assad is a dictatorship. As if Saudi Arabia isn't a dictatorship and wouldn't murder millions of people or thousands of people to stay in power. What about other Gulf states run by kingdoms who would murder their people in great number? They're no different than Assad. In fact, they might be better than Assad because some of them are religiously motivated to the point that it's sort of like communism was a religious conviction. Well, their form of Islam sometimes puts them at odds with Sunnis or Shiites killing each other. The double standard that we have been judging Russia with and basing our policy on that double standard has caused us great harm. Great harm. Putin 5 years ago tried to work out a compromise with us, and we turned him down that would have created at least some sort of semblance of stability in Syria. And now it has totally gone to hell, and we still can't get ourselves to try to look at Putin as a possible partner in cooperation to make things better. I believe it is our hostility towards Russia that has prevented us from creating a policy that will create a more stable Middle East. And Gaddafi, look, we made an agreement with him that we were going to, about Gaddafi. And what did we do? We broke that agreement, and has that resulted, in order to have the alternative, the non-Gaddafi, non-Islamic alternative into power, did that make it any better there? No. Libya today, half of Libya is controlled by people who want to murder us because they're radical Muslims. Had we been working with the Russians all along in good faith, I believe this situation in the Middle East would have been totally different and better, more stable. And let me just note that I can remember the charges, the monstrous charges against us in Iraq. How horrible it was. Our troops were murdering people by the thousands. Most of those reports were false, were wrong. They were lies by people who wanted to achieve a political end by claiming that we were massacring people intentionally in Iraq. Well, I don't know. Is it possible that some of these reports that we're getting, yeah, Assad is a murderous dictator, but some of the magnitude of his oppression and his murder of his own people might be exaggerated to achieve certain political ends? I would think so. And I just about, now I've got a little time to answer. Let me give you a question so you can please feel free to disagree with everything that I say. I believe it, and I know you have your beliefs too, and they're honest disagreements. But let me just ask then about if indeed Assad is removed and we get this third alternative, why won't it be just the same as happened with Gaddafi, where the radical Islamicists who hate us now see a weaker adversary, and it will come in and replace whatever that regime is very quickly with a regime that will control all of Syria, and they will be radicals that will be our worst nightmare? Why wouldn't that happen in Syria the way it happened in Libya?
I need to say something, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Please feel free to retort.
With respect, I can't let it go by the comparison of Bashar al-Assad with our Gulf allies. These countries are not in our image, but there is no way that they oppress their citizens or kill their citizens to the extent that Bashar al-Assad is. But let me
you're saying they wouldn't do that? They would not engage in military use of the military to suppress their people if their guest workers decided to rise up?
Yes, I'm saying that, Mr. Rohrabacher.
They wouldn't?
I know it's a Saudi Arabia is a country I know well, and they would not do that. That's not how it works there. But let me try and answer your question about Syria. There's broad consensus in the international community that the institutions in Syria would remain intact. The intelligence, the military, the police, the civil service, the ministerial structures like health structures, and that the goal is to remove Bashar al-Assad and his closest advisors and have this political process that would lead to a new government. So it is not to destroy the institutional structure. In Libya, I would argue there weren't any institutions.
Okay.
It's a
You've outlined it well. You've outlined it well. Why is it why do we have to go in and make that decision in Syria? Why is it for the United States to step in to this far-off land rather than going to perfect? There's lots of places we could go and perfect. Why is it for us to have to go in and do that when we know that you've got these radical Islamicists who are just waiting on the sideline for some type of instability that they could take advantage of?
Because our national security is at stake in the region, and the security of our allies like Israel and the GCC countries and Lebanon and Jordan Turkey is ultimately affected by what happens in Syria.
That's right, and our policies are making the instability worse, and in fact, with dealing with Putin, instead of trying to demonize him, perhaps we could have had more stability there, and our friends would be actually better off than the current policy of whatever we do, don't work with Russia and get rid of Assad. Putin's also helping us, by the way, with General Sisi, who we only give just a lip service to try to help the man who's a pivotal role in stability in the Middle East.
We need to go to Grace Ming of New York. Time's expired. And
thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here and all that you do for our country. My question is about growing concern of advanced Russian arms entering Syria at unprecedented levels and the possibility for advanced arms to pass to Syrian forces and even to groups like Hezbollah, which is high. What is the U.S. prepared to do to counter this? What have we done? What could we do more to ensure these Russian arms don't end up in the hands of Hezbollah?
Well, we have the same concerns that you do about the advanced weaponry flowing into Syria from Russia, from Iran. We have raised these concerns regularly with the Russians, including at the presidential level, and we are continuing to monitor what exactly happens with them. The Russians, as you know, have now made a decision to put in ground artillery, and that is exacerbating the conflict further in Hama and in Homs.
My second question is, Russia has conducted a number of airstrikes on rebel locations in the Syrian Golan, some strikes which are only about 30 to 40 miles from the Israeli border. Iran has also sent troops and military advisors to shore up Assad's rule, including on the Golan Heights, bringing Iran's influence directly to Israel's doorstep. Jihadist groups, including ISIS and al-Nusra, also continue to gain territory in northern and southern Syria, including along the Golan Heights. In your opinion, how likely is it that fighting in Syria could spill over into Israel? And what are the major concerns from the Israelis, and what can the U.S. do to help?
Congresswoman, nothing's more important to us as a national strategic interest in Israel's security. And all these elements that you have raised, the Russian strikes, the pressure on Nusra in the Golan Heights, the Iranian presence, we are in constant contact with the Israeli government and are working very collaboratively on this. I would say the Israelis can pretty much take care of this problem, and they have shown that in a number of ways that we can perhaps discuss later. But we have lots of collaboration on this issue. On a broader issue, the Prime Minister, of course, will be here. We have given millions of dollars and billions of dollars, including Iron Dome, over the past 3 years, and we'll be discussing ways that we can enhance Israel's security generally. But these are concerns that we share with Israel, and we meet with them and address them in all kinds of ways.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. My question focuses on Syria and then Iran. I've been briefed on the target packages in Syria, and I think as you indicated, I think this is, let me say first of all, when you don't have a strategy and you fail to have a strategy, you end up with a power vacuum, and now we have Russia filling that power vacuum. Not unlike the terrorists do. And now it is really created a complicated situation from my perspective. When I look at the target packages of Russian strikes, as you mentioned, only 90% are anti-Assad, only 10% are even remotely targeted toward ISIS. It raises a question of why is Russia there? What is their intent? I've talked to our partners in the Middle East. Some say that Russia's told them is to defeat ISIS, and then others tell me that the only reason they're there is to support the Assad regime. Very briefly, what do you believe is Russia's intent in the region?
Well, I think their main intent, they have several intent, but their main intent was to shore up to shore up Bashar al-Assad. He was losing ground, significant ground, when they decided to come in. They also want to protect their interest in Tartus. They want to reassert themselves as Ambassador Newland, but their primary interest was to shore up Bashar al-Assad.
I tend to agree with that, and here's the problem that this now presents, is that when I talk to the, 50 Special Forces guys, they're our best, but that's not going to win the day. And I would argue they're in harm's way right now. If there was a strategy, it was a Sunni fighting the Sunni extremists. And when I talk to nations like Turkey and Jordan and the Gulf states, they're willing to put a ground force in there to defeat ISIS, but they would never do so if it emboldened and empowered Assad. And that was kind of part of the agreement. Now that the Russians are in there backing Assad, it doesn't look like he's going anywhere anytime soon. So where do we get our ground force now?
North, and Ambassador Newland can speak more about this. We've been working very closely on an enhanced effort with the Turks to close the border. As I mentioned, the Syrian Arab Coalition, which will be supported by our special forces. And frankly, Mr. McCall, we've had lots of discussions with our Gulf allies and with Jordan about the possibility of introducing ground troops. I think they've probably told you that too. So that's the status of that at this point. We work very closely with the Jordanians about the issues in southern Syria.
Well, and Jordan has been one of our best friends in the region, but again, it's going to be difficult to get a Sunni ground force now that Assad's not part of the. It's going to be difficult to get Assad out now that the Russians are in there.
Let me stress that that is our goal, to get Assad out, and we don't think the Russians are going to have such an easy walk through Syria with the opposition of the entire Sunni world. So there may be a political opening here that we can exploit to move him out.
I think if you could reach a political reconciliation and perhaps even partition the Alawite from the rest of the country, that's a possibility. Right now, it's about deconfliction with the Russians so we don't kill each other over there. Do you foresee any remote possibility of a joint strategy to defeat ISIS with the Russians?
The only way we'd end up in a joint strategy is if the Russians agreed to the general premise that we have to have a ceasefire, we have to have a transitional government, and we have to have a decision on getting rid of Assad. That's what the Secretary's been working on. In the meantime, we're working on ISIS, and they're working in a different part of Syria to defend Assad. So I don't see working together militarily unless and until it's all efforts on a transition, and that would allow us in turn to focus good Syrian forces on.
And I would be very careful in trusting them. But I will tell you, based on the Boston bombing experience, I learned that we have a common enemy, and that's the jihadists, the Chechen rebels. We know there are thousands of them joining ISIS. I predict that Russia's going to have a homeland security problem of their own. And as that becomes more of a problem for them, their desire to move away from protecting the regime to attacking ISIS hopefully will shift.
I think that's what's so frustrating to us, is that we ought to share a goal of defeating ISIS and defeating those who've come from Russia to join ISIS, but that's not what the Russian military is currently focused on.
My last question is with respect to Iran. We've reached this agreement, which I disagreed with, but nevertheless, it's moving forward. And since that time, Iran has taken several provocative actions, including ballistic missile tests, the jailing of Americans on frivolous charges, and support for terrorist activities via the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Quds Force is the terrorist arm of Iran. I sent a letter to the President of the United States requesting that the IRGC be placed on the Foreign Terrorist Organization list because they are the terror arm of Iran. This would not lift the sanctions. It would keep the sanctions in place on the very terrorist activities that Iran wants to take the $100 billion and shift them towards these activities. What is your response to whether or not designating the IRGC as an FTO, whether that is a good decision?
I'm virtually certain they're already subject to sanctions, aren't they, Mr. McCall? Yes, the IRGC.
Well, they're not designated as a foreign terrorist organization, which would make a difference.
I can't answer that question, Mr. McCall. I'll have to get back to you. I would not think they'd meet the legal criteria, but I don't really know. We'll get
I would
back
think
to you.
the IRGC with the Quds Force being the main sponsor of terror within Iran would qualify to be a foreign terrorist organization, though. Hey, Ambassador Newland?
Again, I defer to Ann on questions involving Iran.
Well, I look forward to the President's response. To date, I have not received one at this time. Chair now recognizes Mr. Sherman.
It's always good to have you here. We hear folks say, where's your strategy? That implies that the United States is in control of events, that we own them, that the outcome is determined by what goes on here in Washington. That's a very dangerous viewpoint. We can be a force for good, but to control the outcome, I would ask anybody to put forward a strategy that would lead us to peace, stability, and democracy in Iraq and Syria with modest American casualties and modest American cost. George W. Bush had a strategy to achieve that for Iraq. It failed. And in the future, those who say, where's your strategy, are really saying, why can't you control the world at no cost? And that's a silly question. We're told that by the gentlelady from Florida that the evils of Assad deliver recruits to ISIS. That's correct. But we should point out that the actions of Maliki and many who are still in the Baghdad regime do just as much to help ISIS recruit. Just because the government in Baghdad was installed by us doesn't mean it's part of the solution. It's part of the problem, and we ought to be looking very carefully at our aid to Baghdad when the Wall Street Journal can put on the front page how how so many $100 bills amounting to tens of billions of dollars are shipped from Washington and disappearing in Iraq, except they're turning up in ISIS, with ISIS. Ambassador Patterson, I got one little bit of advice for you, but also it'll help the other bureaus next to you, and that is you ought to hire a couple of folks who are experts in Islamic theology, the Hadith, Islamic jurisprudence. You cannot understand, and you cannot argue, and you cannot persuade if you do not understand the mindset of both our friends and our enemies, both of whom are drawing. And if you need Congress to say not everybody has to pass the Foreign Service exam, one or two experts, because the Foreign Service exam does not ask the difference between a good Hadith and a bad Hadith, I know. So you need some experts in this, both to talk to our friends and understand our enemies. As to chemical weapons, the administration achieved a major victory in getting all chemical weapons out, or virtually all, out of Syria. Now, chlorine remains. Hell, chlorine is next to every pool in my district. You can't prohibit chlorine. It is unfortunate that chlorine has been used illegally as a weapon, but those chemicals that are illegal per se appear to have been removed from Syria. I won't say you had a great plan or a great strategy, but you did have a great result on that issue. The solution to the refugee crisis is peace in Syria, not to cancel Syria and move its population to Europe. We had a policy that many of us pushed here in Congress to arm the reasonable elements in Syria. That policy has basically failed. It's failed for a couple of reasons. First, you did it years after we started pushing for it. But second, it is still subject to the incredible and ridiculous condition that those we arm have to convince us that they do not intend to fight Assad. Any reasonable patriotic Syrian intends to fight Assad. So no wonder we only find 50 people, we only have 5 on the battlefield. How do you find somebody who's reasonable who doesn't hate Assad? And I will point out that while ISIS has the bad taste to put its murders right there on television, beheadings, it is the Shiite alliance of Iran and Assad that pose the greater threat to the United States, have killed far more innocent people, and have killed far more Americans. Now, turning to Russia. Russia is not in a terribly strong position, $45 a barrel oil. They cannot waste resources on peripheral matters. The Ukraine is of vital national interest to Russia. If it fails to protect Russian-speaking persons, Putin's gone. And if the Ukraine is successful, it becomes a model demanding, inspiring all Russians to change and follow that model, given the very close history between the Ukraine and Russia. Syria, in contrast, is not at the center of Russia's universe. There are substantial costs to what Russia is doing. Syria and Assad are very close to the center of Iran's national security. They dream of a Shiite control from Mashhad in eastern Iran to Latakia on the Mediterranean. Assad has been their longest ally. So one would raise the question, why is Iran doing what they're doing, but why is Russia? And then we look at the timing. Russia deployed forces at substantial long-term risk and cost to Russia a couple days after it became certain to those who are observing things, especially here in Congress, that Iran would get its hands on the $130 billion. First, they had to sign the agreement. Till that, they might not get their money. Then you had to look around here and make sure Congress wasn't going to blow up the agreement. Well, it was pretty apparent that we were not going to blow up the agreement a few weeks after it was signed. And it was pretty much like a day or two after a lot of us concluded that Congress was not going to prevent this agreement from going into effect for the first couple of years, that Iran was going to get its hands on the money, that Russia started effort. So the question is, if Iran is giving the money to Assad so he can give money to Russia, or if Iran is sending the money directly to Russia, would we know about it? So I'll ask both of you, since one focuses on Iran, the Middle East, and one on Europe, if there was a transfer of $1 billion from Tehran to Moscow, either through Damascus or otherwise, would we know about it, and would it be public?
Congressman, I don't think at this stage we've seen any evidence of payments to Russia. On the contrary, we see Russia hemorrhaging money on its latest adventure in Syria.
But if there was a transfer, and obviously Iran doesn't quite have its hands on the money yet, so Putin's going to have to wait a little while. But if there was a transfer of $1 billion this winter, are you confident that you'd know about it?
Let me answer that as not confident, but I think the chances are pretty good.
Pretty good, you know. Okay. And Ambassador Newland?
Well, if it was in any dollar-denominated form, we would likely know, but if they wanted to do a bushel of Iranian currency or rubles, maybe not.
Or euros. I
think we'd know, yeah.
You'd know about a transfer of $1 billion. So let me then ask, obviously North Korea was paid $1 billion, $500 million for Al-Kabar and then the tremendous aid that they provided to a Syrian or Syrian-Iranian nuclear program. Did we know about that? Or did the Israelis bring to us the fact that Al-Kabar was a nuclear site many years after North Korea received payment?
I don't know the answer to that, Mr. Sherman. I know that we have extremely close cooperation with the Israelis. They have sources that we don't have. I just don't know the answer.
No, well, Israel spotted the location. Nobody spotted the money. And so the confidence that bad guys can't move money without us knowing, or that Russia is financing this without being paid by Iran, is untested. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes itself for questions. Thank you, ambassadors, for being here. The The use of DOD, of these 50 special operators, the other folks that aren't characterized as boots on the ground, is an extension of diplomacy to means of exacting the policy that we would like to see happen in the Middle East or anywhere. It's just an extension, I think, if you would kind of see it in those terms as Clausewitz did. With that in mind, is there any, because it keeps on being stated that this is not a combat mission, so is there anywhere in the mix that State Department is in the chain of command and decision-making at all for what these special operators or people that wear a military uniform or are paid by the Department of Defense acting in Syria and Iraq in this operation? Is there any State Department involvement in the decision-making process about what they do, where they go, and how they conduct their business?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the State Department, through the Secretary, through General Allen, who was seconded to the State Department, participate in all these discussions, and they work closely with the Turkish government to work on the effort to close the border. And these Special Forces advisors are critical to that effort. So yes, we've been deeply involved in that.
You're involved in the chain of command, so do you do...
Certainly not, sir. They're not the chain of command, but the overall policy process, and particularly there have been State Department representatives, General Allen, now Brett McGurk, and others on these teams, Ambassador Newland, who have discussed these efforts at great length with the Turks.
To come to some conclusion, and then the military command makes the decisions and issues the orders commensurate with what you've come up with.
Commensurate with what the President of the United States comes up with and instructs them to do. But of course, these Special Forces advisors are under the command of General Lloyd Austin.
Okay, so what is their mission? These 50, up to 50 is what I hear, up to 50 what is their mission?
Congressman, with respect, I think that's a question that we're going to defer to DOD and defer in a classified session probably.
I mean, you've had the discussions, right? You just said you had the discussions, but you can't tell me the mission right now, and that's classified yet. In everything I read, it's to advise and assist. I expected you to say advise and assist. Is that not their mission?
Yeah, that's to advise and assist, but what we can't sit here and tell you, Mr. Chairman, is where these fellows are going to be deployed, exactly whom they're going to be working with, exactly how many are going to be on the ground.
Okay, I didn't ask you any of that, but I appreciate it.
Advise and assist.
To advise and assist to what end? What's the goal?
The goal is to enhance our efforts to defeat ISIL, and we can, we'd be happy to give you a broader briefing on this.
I mean, I think I understand it, but I want to make sure.
To close the border, sir. To close the border so ISIL can't get recruits and ISIL can't export refined products, and to put pressure on Raqqa, which is basically ISIL headquarters.
This goes to a larger strategy. So if you're telling me it's to achieve, the goal is to close the border and somehow, at some point, defeat ISIS. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I see. That's what I hear. Close the border, defeat ISIS. All right, we got 50 guys that are going. Doesn't that just strengthen Assad? Right? So he's got ISIS and he's got local Sunni insurgents that are fighting him. And we take ISIS, let's just say in a perfect world, everything in the strategy that we have, if you want to call it that we, with these 50 guys, defeat ISIS. Doesn't that strengthen Assad?
You can't solve the problem of ISIL separate from the problem of Assad.
I understand that.
Okay.
Okay, so,
no.
But tell me what happens if, let's just say the perfect thing happens, that you get what you want, and our 50 operators in conjunction with the Kurds and whoever they're working with, assisting and advising, defeat ISIS. Is Assad strengthened or is he weakened? He's got Russia there right behind him right now, attacking the very people that we've trained and are supporting.
You have to do both. I persist in.
But we're not doing both. We're doing one.
We're
right?
fighting ISIL, and we're trying to get a political settlement to get President Assad.
Okay, so you don't want to answer that, but I would say that it does empower and increase the power of Assad. It does that, and so. With all due respect to the gentleman that was just sitting here, when he says there's no strategy, and you people that say that there's no strategy and that a strategy assumes that we can control everything from the United States, that's absurd. We had a strategy in World War II. We couldn't control the Emperor of Japan or the Führer or Stalin. But we had a strategy, and sometimes we had to deviate and adapt, but we had a strategy. I would say this is not a strategy, but that's my contention. Now, I'm going to take some liberties here because everybody else seems to have done that. The President has said, his White House press secretary said that this is not a combat mission, right? Is Syria a combat zone? I mean, they're dropping bombs and they're shooting each other, and is it a combat zone or isn't it?
Extremely complex battlefield, and what the President said is what you just quoted back to me, Mr. Chairman, that it was an advise and assist mission.
Right. So they're not to patrol or travel with opposition groups, but it also says that it could change as the situation dictates. Now, I expect you to tell me because I'm going to ask you what would change, what changes would dictate, what situation would dictate them changing that, not patrolling or traveling with, but you're going to tell me that that's a classified setting.
Oh, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you that I don't know, and that's up to the President of the United States and the situation. Of course, he always reserves the right to change the role of American forces.
Let me ask you this. If this isn't a combat zone and these forces are not on a combat mission, how is it that in May, Delta Force commandos entered Syria aboard helicopters and Ospreys and killed an Islamic State leader and about a dozen militant fighters, and one of our soldiers was killed just about a week and a half ago? If that's not what is that?
That is, and that was a Sergeant Wheeler who grew up 20 miles from where I'm from. That was a mission to save Kurdish hostages and other hostages. They rescued.
I know that, but you understand when we imperil these young men and women raise their hand and say they're going to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and pledge their lives, and it's with the proviso that the commander-in-chief and that the administration and the powers that be are going to sacrifice their lives for nothing. And these people are going into combat. We're saying it's not combat, but indeed it is combat.
Mr. Chairman, of course it's combat, and don't. These people go into combat because the President of the United States orders.
That's right. They go into combat. Somebody loses their life, and they don't come home with a Purple Heart because they weren't in combat. They don't come back with the correct SGLI because they weren't in combat. Do you understand the ramifications of pledging your life and pledging their lives? It is important. Just a couple other things. Because I reject the whole situation. The gentleman next to me who said there was no strategy, that those of us that said there was no strategy didn't have a strategy. That's absurd. There isn't a strategy. This is all tactics. And that George W. Bush didn't have a strategy. You might not have agreed with it and might not have agreed with it at times, but there's a strategy. And I would also reject that the war in Iraq destabilized the area. Up until the President left Iraq, it was pretty stable. It was pretty stable. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't what it is now. With that, I will recognize Mr. Trott. Thank you.
I want to thank the chair and also thank both of you for being here today and for everything you do for our country. Ambassador Patterson, would you say our policy in the last 4 years has been a success in Syria?
That we've not succeeded in removing Bashar al-Assad from power, and I would say that ISIL is not defeated, but it will be a long, hard struggle to defeat ISIL.
And do you think that, insouciance on the part of the administration has contributed to our failure or not really impacted it? I mean, is the inability to make a decision a few years back complicated where we are today?
I don't want to speculate on that, Mr. Trott. I don't know, and I wasn't around when those decisions were made, and I don't want to speculate. We are where we are now.
Right. So let's look forward. So the policy going forward is we're going to have 50 special forces. We're going to continue with the airstrikes, and we've heard a lot of criticism of our policy there. Last week, one day, Russia attacked 94 targets. We attacked 1. We're going to start and have been calling out Russia for violating international law with respect to their rules of engagement. We're going to ask Assad to stop dropping barrel bombs on his citizens. We're going to have meetings about a transitional government. Iran will be at the table. Opposition groups may or may not be. And this strategy, as best I can discern this morning, is going to work because this is too complex for Russia. They're going to lose interest they're going to run out of money, and it's just too difficult. Is that a fair statement of our strategy going forward? And if it isn't, please enlighten me as to how you believe the strategy is different than what I just described.
I think our strategy is no, I don't think that's a fair characterization of our strategy.
I mean, I've heard a number of times today, Russia really isn't going to be in it for the long haul. They don't have the money. They've got other problems. This is not a strategic interest that they want to put resources behind. So it seems to me that the gamble we're taking going forward is our strategy is going to succeed because Russia's going to lose interest. Tell me what I missed.
Well, no, our strategy is to mobilize the rest of the international community, including our Gulf allies, and Turkey, to work toward a political solution, and to work hard to defeat ISIL. I think the contributions of on the defeat of ISIL and the efforts we're taking against ISIL, which aren't just the 50 special forces, but also the strengthening of our position at Incirlik, the steps we're taking in Iraq, will all accelerate the defeat of ISIL. So that is a key element of this that's sort of been, in my view, underplayed in this hearing.
Ambassador Patterson, you said earlier we're talking to the Russians. So two questions. Are they listening? I know we have the MOU that was entered into last month, so that's perhaps evidence that they're listening. But are they really listening to what our objectives and goals are, and what evidence do you have that the fact that we're talking to the Russians is moving them around on what our different goals are in Syria?
Congressman, as we have said throughout the morning, the conversations we've been having with them have not affected their military choices. They have not changed their pattern of bombing. They have also not taken us up on our insistence that a minimum price for their support for Assad ought to be to get him to stop barrel bombing. So on the military side, I would say that they are not listening. They're also not listening to the Gulf Arabs. They're not listening to the Europeans. They're not listening to the vast majority of innocent, peaceful Sunnis who are greatly concerned about the collateral damage from their dumb bombs. That said, we do have them in this political process that Secretary Kerry is leading. In that process, they are in the minority in terms of their perception of how long Assad should stay. So the question is whether continuing to participate in that will bring the force of the majority to cause them to reevaluate their view.
Ambassador Nuland, you said a few minutes ago that it will be difficult to get in, if I'm putting words in your mouth incorrectly, please tell me. But basically, I think you said that it will be difficult to get to a transitional government if Russia never gets on the same page with respect to our goals in Syria. And if that's a fair statement, or if they never listen to us with respect to their military operations. So assuming for the moment they never listen, we never get on the same page, what do we do then?
I don't think I quite characterized it the way you did. One thing that the Russians have said is that the Syrian people should be in charge of their own future. So the other piece of this that I think we've underplayed this morning, although I would defer to Assistant Secretary Patterson, is where the Syrian representatives, whether they are regime folk other than Assad or whether they are streams of the opposition, want to take this, given the fact that the country's being torn apart by what's happening now.
But just looking down the road, if Russia doesn't want to ever move towards a transitional government, what do we do then?
Again, I think we can't project a straight line from here to there. We are increasing our support for the moderate opposition. We are raising the cost for hitting the wrong folk. We are trying to mobilize the rest of the international community to lean on the Russians. We will see that this thing is costing them. It's also costing them at home.
Right, I'll yield back. But I think it's a mess. It's when we had good options, we didn't make a decision several years ago. And I think what someone said earlier today is exactly correct, which is we're just trying to run out the clock. And so the next administration will inherit a situation in Syria that has Russia just as engaged as it is today, and our options will be even more limited. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you both being here. I'm amazed at the level of what appears to me, I've only been here for 3 years in Congress, but it appears to be a high level of incompetence, lack of strategy, lack of planning, and it's almost laughable other than there's been over 250,000 Syrians slaughtered, the billions of dollars it's cost us, the risk to our military. And, you know, I look at this stuff, and I just want to go through a timeline since my time in Congress. You know, in Obama, August 2013, this administration was going to attack Syria and do no-fly zones. We sat at the White House. There was no strategy. They didn't have an estimate of the cost. Mr. McDonough, the chief of staff, said it would be over $1 billion a month. I asked him how long it was going to take. He said estimated 10 years at $1 billion a month, and we had just shut down. There was no authorization to go over there. We're attacking a sovereign nation without an AUMF, and you know, those are President Obama went on to say there was a red line if Syria uses a chemical weapons. They used it. There was no follow through. They failed to act. The president and John Kerry both said that Assad must go. Then they denied it, said they didn't say that. The world said that. John Kerry said there was no diplomatic solution to the chemical weapons problem in Syria. Yet 2 weeks later, after he said that, Russia jumped in there, showed leadership, and within 2 weeks, there's an agreement to get rid of the chemical weapons. And I find it interesting that we didn't think that could happen, yet Russia brokered it, and we wound up paying for it. President said no boots on the ground multiple times, no boots on the ground, no boots on the ground. And then we went with a $500 million to train, equip, and arm 5,000 to 6,000 vetted Free Syrian rebel fighters, whatever that is. And we find out a year later that's a complete failure. They've trained possibly 40 to 50, but only 5 made it to the field at the cost of $50 million. That's $10 million a fighter. It's got to be laughable other than it's reality, and it's just bad form. And I guess my question's, why hasn't the president worked to create the safe zones when especially the chairman of this committee, Chairman Royce, and Ranking Member Engel asked for that 4 years ago? Why has that not happened?
Because it's hugely difficult, complex, and
okay, I'm going to stop you there because you said that earlier today.
Okay,
it's hugely complicated, difficult, expensive.
Resource intensive.
Resource intensive. I'm going to stop you there because I want to add this. This is what I wanted you to bring out. It's complicated, extensive, very costly. How costly is it to have 4 million displaced refugees that have gone around the world, that have disrupted the whole world as far as refugees just leaving there? 7.5 million displaced in Syria. That's pretty costly too, isn't it? Isn't that disruptive?
That is costly, and we're trying to contribute to alleviate that problem. But let me talk in more detail about some of these safe zones or exclusion zones. The Department of Defense has not proposed an option that does not have a very significant contribution investment of U.S. air power. That air power would be diverted from the fight against ISIL. The fight against ISIL, which is an extraordinarily virulent terrorist group, is a threat to us and our allies and the neighbors. So that is the first priority. It is also extremely difficult to patrol and to protect these safe zones on the ground, and that would require a very significant investment of ground forces of some sort. But the primary reason is the investment of air power.
I just, you know, if we're going to attack this, we need to attack it. And the lack of diplomatic efforts, or even a hint of that over the last 3 years, I've not seen it until Russia steps in there. And then Russia puts in 2,000 troops, brings in the tanks, brings in all this armament, and we respond with 50 ground troops when the president said no American troops on the ground. This is an escalation. This is the beginning of an escalation of troops that are going to happen. And my question, to both of you is, why should I or anybody on this committee or anybody in Congress support anything this administration attempts with such a poor strategy of winning this? You know, the president doesn't even come out and acknowledge who are fighting ISIL, radical Islamic jihadists. They won't even acknowledge that, yet we're going to kind of go at this and kind of do little efforts to try to defeat ISIL. I think it's a joke. And again, my question is, why should I support anything this administration does in the Middle East, or Syria, Middle East, or even in Ukraine, with the lack of strategy that I see? And you were talking about how we've got to protect Israel, but yet we have the Iran nuclear deal that does anything but protect Israel. And, you know, why should I support this, anything they're doing?
Well, I guess the short answer, Congressman, is that ISIL is a threat to us and to our European allies and to the neighbors in the region. And we're already seeing incursions by ISIL, pressure against Jordan and pressure against Saudi Arabia. I think that's the short answer. You've asked a much broader question, I think, but I think that's the short answer to your question.
Well, if we're going to attack them, if we're going to do this, let's do it right, and let's get a strategy, and let's make it count instead of just kind of playing around with it. And I don't mean playing around with it, because we've got troops on the ground, and I'm sure if they're on the ground, they don't think they're playing. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman from Florida without objection. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Jeff Fortenberry of Nebraska, a former member of this committee who has remained engaged on these issues, and particularly the plight of Christians and other religious minorities in this region of the world. Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Ambassadors, welcome. I'm sorry I didn't have the benefit of hearing the earlier conversation, but I do want to divert to the question that the Chairman just laid out. Before I do so, Ambassador Patterson, we met a number of years ago when you were in the consulate at Peshawar, Pakistan. That was a few days before there was an assassination or kidnapping attempt upon you. And then from there, as I recall, you went on to become ambassador in Pakistan as well as Egypt. So I just want to thank you for your many years of dedicated service in very difficult areas. I don't think we've had any interaction, Ambassador Newland, but I appreciate both of your willingness to testify today. One of the grave concerns in the Middle East is this, and let me divert for a moment by telling you a story. I happened to be in an audience with Pope Francis a little while back, and he was presented a small Christian crucifix. It was worn by a young Syrian man who was captured by the jihadists, and he was told to convert, and he refused. And he chose his own ancient faith tradition, Christianity, and he was beheaded. His mother was able to recover his body and found the cross and fled and made her way to Austria, where she settled as a refugee. And through that means, one of the persons that I was with in this audience was able to present that to Pope Francis. One of the more dramatic parts of this crisis that seems to come and go in regards to our attention is this deliberate, systematic attack on Christians and other faith traditions, including Yazidis and other religious minorities. And by the way, I have the largest Yazidi refugee population in America where I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. Is this genocide?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a legal term. I think there'll be some announcements on that very shortly.
Well, I would appreciate both of your willingness to engage robustly on this topic. The reason is we have, as the chairman alluded to, introduced a resolution that does call this genocide. And while there are certain international legal implications from that, nonetheless, elevating the plight of Christians and other religious minorities in their own ancient homeland, including Syria, which is approximately, Christians are about 10% of the population, raises the international consciousness of this and provides a gateway for further strategy around defense and security measures, as well as, once all of this hopefully in the future stabilizes, reintegration of those populations back into their rightful homelands. And this is a very important, I think, gateway to use this resolution, or the resolution is an important gateway for not only the discussion to elevate consciousness, but again, a larger platform as to how to stabilize these areas and demand that the rich diversity of religious tradition that has existed in some of these areas be allowed to flourish, not only return, but flourish as a part of any political or security settlement moving forward. I think there's significant problems with this, obviously, in Iraq as well. We have been able to form a new burgeoning relationship with the Kurds, who have been very respectful of religious plurality and have undertaken waves of immigration or refugee populations and absorbed that, as well as the Jordanians and the Lebanese. This is a very important component as we move forward and think through a strategy that actually brings about some stability and maybe a political settlement moving forward. In this regard, there's another problem, however, that I'd like to point out. It's my understanding that we've only admitted 53 Christians as refugees from the conflict in Syria. So that's disproportionate, obviously, to the population size. Can you give any perspective on that, please?
My colleague Ann Richard was here with Mr. Rodriguez a few weeks ago to talk about refugee admission policy. And the numbers, I think we've admitted about, as of today, about a little over 2,000 Syrians, and we're planning to admit some more, of course. They have to meet very strict vetting requirements and research into their particular circumstances and background. I don't have an answer why the Christians are underrepresented.
I think one of the challenges is that Christians are generally not in refugee camps, so they will be diverse, or they'll be spread out through the population, whether it's in the basement of a relative or in some church basement or in some other circumstance versus cordoned into some definable entity like a refugee camp. I think it's part of the problem, but clearly this segment of Syria's population is under grave stress, as are others.
Mr. Fortenberry, we entirely agree that these communities are under enormous stress, and we've been in close contact with them through their religious leaders, both in country and their religious leaders here in the U.S. And we're very mindful of the point you make that they have to be the most desirable outcome for them after thousands of years is that they be reintegrated into these countries and not dispersed. So we try to work with these communities. We try and sustain them. But I will take your point back about the refugee admissions and get you an answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for accommodating me today, and pleasure to speak with you both. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair also recognizes Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much. I know you've been here for a while, and I was over at the White House with a series of appointments, but I did want to try to come here, not so much to ask questions, but to publicly compliment both of you. You're two of the most capable people I've had the pleasure of dealing with and meeting, and hardworking and smart and tenacious and all the nice things I can say about both of you. So I just want to thank both of you for your service to our country. It really means a great deal when we can have people of your caliber and intellect and hard work and work ethic working for the United States of America. So I just want to thank you. I've treasured the times through the years that I've had the opportunity to speak with both of you in person, on the telephone, and everything else. So just thank you. I'm sure everything's been covered, and I will read the scripts very, very, very carefully. But neither one of you has ever said no to me when I needed to meet with you or ask you something. And just a very great bipartisan thank you to both of you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair would also like to thank the ambassadors for being here. We know that you're sent here on a tough mission, and please don't take any of the remarks from the dais here as personal. We have a charge of oversight and to get the answers on our behalf of our constituents, and as you can tell, many of us on both sides of the aisle are very frustrated with the circumstance. I do have one question before you pack it all up that I think a lot of people watch what's happening and they don't know the answer to this. Ambassador Patterson, you said, I think you were asked earlier about the refugee flow into Europe and why some of the Arab countries weren't doing more except for paying to help ameliorate that. And I think the sense is why aren't they taking some of or many of these refugees? And I think your answer was they are very different societies and they don't accept and so on and so forth. And with all due respect, it seems to me that Europe is a very different society than much of Arabia. What are we doing nothing? Do we have no plan? Do we have no interest in urging and pressuring and cajoling our Arab partners, so to speak, in the region, bordering Syria, particularly, to take any of these refugees or do anything more than have them move lock, stock, and barrel across seas, dangerous journeys across land and mountains and cold and everything, a cultural difference for them, into Europe? Is there no other effort in that regard?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, there are efforts to encourage these countries to take in more refugees. It's not that hundreds of thousands of Syrians don't live in these countries. I think the issue for these countries is that they have, a number of them have tiny domestic populations and population of foreigners, guest workers that are in some cases 8-10 times the local population. So they're very reluctant to take in additional
But isn't that a
refugees.
similar circumstance in many of the European countries, the smaller ones, that the same exact circumstance is present at that moment? They're small populations currently, and they're being overrun. Their services are being overrun by people of completely different culture.
But again, we've encouraged the Gulf countries to take in more refugees, and again, we've encouraged them to give generously to the UN.
Is there any plan for more than encouragement, like some subtle pressure maybe? Diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, pressure to help alleviate the situation. It seems fantastic to many of us that they are happy to help watch this inflow of humanity into Europe and take almost virtually none of it in themselves.
Well, again,
And I know some of the countries in the region have, but some have not, and some of the larger ones have not.
Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey have taken millions of these refugees.
But there's other ones that border that have not taken.
Yes, and the other thing, I think the phenomenon we're seeing at this time now is that most of them prefer to join family members who have gone to these other countries. I actually do not think there's been such a draw for these refugees to resettle in the Gulf. Again, there are hundreds of thousands of Syrians.
Well, if they're not welcomed in the Gulf, and they are welcomed in Europe after leaving a war, once you decide to leave everything, I would imagine you would go where you feel more welcome. But if you're not welcomed at all in the neighboring countries, you're going to choose the best of your options, I would imagine. And so that's just a thought, and I think that a lot of Americans ask that question, so I appreciate your answer. I would hope that an administration would do more, as much as it could, to encourage our partners and allies in the region to do more than what they are doing in regard to physically taking those refugees. And I thank you. At this time, this hearing is adjourned.